evening, Eileen. Can you please open up the meeting? Do not disturb.
Township of Howell Zoning Board of Adjustment, Monday, September 23rd, 2024. I hereby declare this meeting of the Howell Township Zoning Board to be open. Adequate notice been given pursuant to the New Jersey Open Public Meeting Act in the following manner. First, on December 11th, 2023, a copy of said notice was mailed to the Asbury Park Press and the Star Ledger. Second, on December 11th, 2023, a copy of said notice was hand-delivered to the clerk of the Township of Howell. Third, on December 11th, 2023, said notice was posted in the office of the Zoning Board and on the bulletin board in the Howell Township Municipal Building, 4567, Route 9, Howell Township, New Jersey. In accordance with the Fire Prevention Code and for your safety, please be advised that this facility is designed with 2 emergency exits at the front and rear of the meeting room. Furthermore, smoking is not permitted in the municipal building. Please take note that this meeting is being videotaped for possible future broadcasts on Howell Township TV 77. This meeting is a judicial proceeding. Any questions or comments must be limited to the issues of what the board may legally consider in reaching a decision, and a decorum appropriate to judicial hearing must be maintained at all times. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. For the record, Mr. Stanton and Mr. Orozco are both excused tonight.
Okay.
May we have a roll call, please?
Mr. Barillo.
Here.
Mr. Cantor.
Here.
Mr. Hughes.
Here.
Mr. Mertens.
Here.
Mr. Orozco is excused. Mr. Stanton is excused. Mr. Ryan.
Present.
Ms. Scottson.
Here.
Chairman Saya.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you, Eileen. Will everybody please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Andy, can we have a swearing in of the professionals? Oh, it's not it. Miss Carey, please.
Raise your hand. Do you swear affirm the testimony you're about to give in this matter is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
State your name for the record. Do we do that?
Charles Cunliffe.
Jennifer Beam.
Your professionals are sworn.
Thank you, ma'am. Eileen, approval of minutes. Any minutes?
No minutes to approve tonight.
How about vouchers?
No vouchers tonight.
Do we have any correspondence?
I have 4 things for correspondence.
One at a time, please.
Okay. Case number BA 2401, Howell Medical Investors will be rescheduled to November 4th, 2024, with an extension through that date. They will be renoticing.
Okay, so anyone that's here for case number BA 24-01, Howell Medical Investors, LLC, this application will be carried to November 4th, 2024 with a renotice. Next one.
Case number BA 2316, the Center for Education New Jersey has requested to be carried to November 25th, 2024, with no further notice and an expiration date of January 1st, 2025.
Okay, case number BA 23-16, the Center for Education New Jersey. This application is being carried to November 25th without further notice. Expiration date 1 January 2025. Next one.
Sal L. Fury, the attorney for Freehold Welding, is appearing another night for case BA 2128 Freehold Welding for an extension of time.
He's going to show up again another time.
Yes.
Okay, so anyone that's here for the extension of time of BA 21-28, this will be heard at a later date.
Just extension.
It's just the extension, yes. Next one.
Just to remind the board members to complete the stormwater training and to email Eileen Urbano when you have completed the training. I just have 2 people that haven't completed it. So.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are we all good
Yes, all of you there are good.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Let the record reflect.
Okay, resolutions. Case number BA 18-17 Alpha, John Blewett. This is a resolution granting use variance, C variances, and subdivision approval. Eligible voters, Barillo, Cantor, Hughes, Mertens, Ryan, Scottson, and Saya. May I have a motion, please?
I'll make a motion.
Hughes,
I'll second it.
Ryan, roll call, please.
Mr. Barillo,
Yes.
Mr. Cantor,
Yes.
Mr. Hughes,
Yes.
Mr. Mertens,
Yes.
Mr. Ryan,
Yes.
Ms. Scottson,
Yes.
and Chairman Saya.
Yes.
Resolution is approved.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, just double checking. All right, case before us tonight, case number BA 24-03, Third Avenue Associates, Inc. This is a use variance and preliminary and final major site plan. The description: application of Third Avenue Associates, Inc. as applicant and United Fellowship Baptist Church as owner seeking use variance and preliminary and final major site plan relief to develop the current vacant property into a cemetery on blocks known as Block 219, Lot 13, Adelphia Farmingdale Road. This application was partially heard on July 8, 2024, when it was carried to August 26, 2024, with no further notice. On August 26, 2024, this application was carried to September 23, 2024. Expiration date on this is August 31, 24. So Eileen, we're going to have to fix that eventually.
Yes.
Mr. Jackson.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. John Jackson, again on behalf of the applicant. We have another expert, Dr. Dennis Stankin, who I don't see here yet. I spoke to him 6 o'clock, well, earlier, 5 o'clock. He was on his way here, so hopefully he'll show up soon. I have Mr. Rob Siv. He is going to give some additional testimony. You may recall that he provided testimony. He is a civil engineer, and he has testimony about nearby wells and the flow of the water in the area of the proposed use.
So, Mr. Chairman, I think there's an opposing attorney here that probably wants to give his appearance.
Okay.
Yes, good evening. Edward Bonanno, Pringle Quinn Anzano, on behalf of objectors, 4 objectors, Richard Buck, Joyce Marciniak, Krista Reagan, and Thomas Klein.
I'm sorry, can you give me that?
Can you do the names one more time of who you represent?
Yes, Richard Buck,
Okay.
Joyce Marciniak, Krista Reagan, and Thomas Klein. And I'd sent a letter to the board identifying my clients and also the
Thank you.
lot and blocks where they live. Thank you.
So, Mr. Chair, we'll let the applicant continue, and then at the end, we'll give the objector his
Yes, so
opportunity.
Mr. Bonanno, just so you're representing the 4.
Yes,
Yes, and so if those 4, everything's going to come through you with regards to questions and comments.
that's correct.
Okay.
There are other
And if
parties
there's
here.
anyone out in the audience that's outside of those 4 that are being represented, you will have an opportunity during public to go ahead and ask your questions and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Jackson.
Thank you. With your permission, Mr. Siv, I have a couple of questions on follow-up.
Talk louder.
Is that the,
That person with the microphone, you just have to talk louder.
Thank you. Hopefully that's better. That's not something I hear very often, to talk louder. So there's a first for everything. So, Mr. Siv, and I believe it'll be your custom, you're still under oath from last time, is that acceptable to council?
Yes.
Mr. Siv, at the last hearing, there were questions about the direction of the water flow, and et cetera, at the site. Have you had an opportunity to give that a further look, some further investigation?
We did review the Monmouth County aerial topography. There is a localized high point at the intersection of Delphia Road and West Farms Road, right in front of the Evergreen Cemetery. We are downstream of that. It is anticipated and expected to have the groundwater flow from that high point towards our east, so it would be from west to east across our site.
So with the Board Secretary's permission, if we could put our PowerPoint up on the screen, and I have additional copies. I believe that's the same PowerPoint we handed out last time.
This one, correct?
Yes, and I think the front page will do the trick with the page. Why do I have one?
I got one.
So, Mr. Siv, this high point of the property, can you please identify where that is and where that is in relation to other properties?
So the high point, the regional or local high point in the area is to the top of the image, and it flows from the west to the east. There's also a local high point on our site, which again flows to the bottom of the page or to the east or south.
Where are the adjoining residences in relation to our site?
So the adjoining residents are to our north.
And if we can flip over to the next page, page 2 on the PowerPoint. Can you show some of the other features in the area and the direction that you would anticipate that the groundwater would flow?
All right, so I'm just trying to orient myself as well. So the subject site is located, this is the train tracks. The subject site is located where the pointer is pointing. The high point is generally in this location at the intersection of West Farms and Delphia, and that is the Evergreen Cemetery.
That's the Evergreen. So approximately how far is the Evergreen Cemetery from our site and from the nearby sites, the nearby homes?
So it's approximately 3 lots to our west, or about, I'm going to say 500 to 700, 1,000 feet away, depending on where you measure it from in the cemetery.
So we're going near where there is a cemetery.
Correct, and that is higher elevation-wise than the subject property.
In relation to further away and away from the residential homes, which way does the topography go and what are the features, I guess to the lower point of image 2? Please explain.
So again, the surface flow, the topography goes from the west to the east across our property.
Can we please go back to and then it's all woods downstream from there or downhill from there as it were?
Right, there's wetlands associated with the Marsh Bog Brook. The wetlands are on our property and everything drains to that location from our primary part of the site.
In your experience as a civil engineer, does the groundwater flow, is that predictable based upon the topography? And if so, please explain.
So for this site, it's reasonable to expect the groundwater to flow in the same direction as the surface water of the topography, being that the Marsh Bog Brook is the low point of this general area of Howell. It's not unreasonable to expect the groundwater flow in that same direction.
Could that be, if the board were to approve this application, could that be confirmed with borings as a condition of approval?
Correct. There is abilities to monitor the direction of groundwater flow via monitoring wells and other means.
But what's your, degree of certainty that the groundwater would flow in that direction?
Again, it's very reasonable and expected for it to flow from the west to the east across our site.
Okay. Mr. Shiv, as a civil engineer, are you familiar with any DEP regulations, Department of Environmental Protection regulations, that identify cemeteries as a hazard?
I am not aware of any.
And in this instance, are any Department of Environmental Protection applications, permits, or certifications required in terms of the environmental impact of a cemetery?
I'm not aware of those permits now.
Have you had an opportunity to take a look at any of the records, governmental records that are available pertaining to the wells, the potable wells, the drinking water wells that are nearby? And if so, please explain what you did and what your findings were.
So sure, after the last meeting, we submitted an OPRA request to the Monmouth County Health Department to ask for the records available for the surrounding properties to the subject property. I met with the health department to make photocopies of what they did have on file. They did have on file some information for some of the nearby septics and wells, and I was able to get copies of those.
Do you have copies of those documents?
I do.
Have you made, can we mark those and with your permission, if I can mark them as an exhibit, we'll go through them after I hand them out. You have how many copies?
There's probably about 10 or so there.
10, this is just the one page.
Correct.
16.
Yeah, that would be that.
Loud enough?
Thank you.
Oh, he's got it.
A16. Yeah.
Is that A16?
Yes.
Correct.
That's fine, don't worry.
There's also, I don't know if you want the well depth of the neighboring well. It's just the one well.
How many copies?
Again, it's about 10.
Okay. I have another document that goes with that.
He has another document that goes with this.
Is that a separate exhibit?
Yeah.
A17? If everybody's got it, I know it's not the best copy, but it's the copy I got from the health department. And what you're looking at on Exhibit A16 is a copy of a plan for a septic approval for the property at tax lot 13.01. And what's helpful about this is, as part of their approval, they showed where their existing well and septic is, as well as the existing septic and well on the adjacent lot 13.02. So based on this plan, we were able to plot the locations of those wells and septics for those two adjacent properties. And then just as a second exhibit, which I'm presuming we are calling A17, it is the well permit for the well on lot 13.02, which shows that that well is about 212 feet deep. And that's the only information that I was able to get from the health department for those wells and septics in that area. Okay.
So, Mr. Siv, in your opinion as a civil engineer, would the water flow, any groundwater, any runoff that would originate at the cemetery, would that flow toward any of the homes?
No, the homes are higher in elevation than our site, so the surface water would flow from the west to the east towards the brook, and we would expect the groundwater to do the same.
And in connection with, I know we discussed this last time, maybe we could put up, would 6 be a good one to put up the drainage? Or what would be a good one to just?
Sure.
6? Which one of these would be the best one? Just where the basins are and stuff. Please put up slide number 3.
And on what you're looking there is the colored rendering of the proposed site plan with the 3 tan colored shapes, the proposed basin locations.
So can you just explain or review once again what those features are on there? Start with the adjoining residential properties, talk about the railroad tracks and the road and everything else so we can just get our orientation,
So
please.
to get orientation, Adelphia Road is in the upper right corner of the exhibit. Our site comes in off of the Adelphia Road via a 30-foot wide driveway, circulates through the site in a counterclockwise fashion. There is a natural high point, approximately where the pointer is shown on the north or southwesterly portion of the property, which will drain to the basin in the bottom left corner of the exhibit. And again, the remainder of the site will drain to the 2 basins on the east part of the property, with the residences to the north or west of the subject property on the top part of the exhibit.
I notice the way you design this is the basins are all on the far side of the cemetery. and furthest away from the houses and along the, the bottom of the image. Was that fortuitous? Why is it set up that way? How come it's designed that way with all the basins away?
The basins are designed in a low part of the property. Obviously, stormwater, surface water drains downhill. So you generally put the basins in the low part of the site so that we can collect the water and manage it before we discharge it.
Just some other features. I note there is a bright yellow line above the green that parallels the green portion. Can you just please explain what that yellow line is, what the separation is between the yellow line and the green, what the green represents, et cetera? Just with the pointer, just tell us what those different features do.
The yellow is the subject property's boundary. The green is the proposed area for the plots. And then the area between the yellow line and the green is the 50-foot wide buffer that we're maintaining to maintain the existing trees that are in that area.
So there'll be 50 feet of forested area between where the cemetery will be and the adjoining residential properties.
Correct. We're proposing to maintain that 50-foot wide buffer area.
Why did you pick a 50-foot buffer? Is that by ordinance? Is that good practice?
By ordinance.
I know,
Correct.
that's what I was getting to.
Yes.
Why? They say you're supposed to know the answers when you're a lawyer. Thank you. Why 50 feet?
Because that's what the ordinance
That's
requires.
what the ordinance requires. So that's what Howell Township's ordinance has determined is an adequate and appropriate buffer between development, activity, and adjoining residential properties.
That's the ordinance buffer, correct?
Mr. Jackson, I just want to note for the record, though, that you're not 100% compliant with the buffer requirements because you are clearing and grading on the northerly property line. I do understand that that Shari, our tree expert, has discussed this with you and is fine with it, but you're not 100% compliant, correct?
That would be for Mr. Siv, not for me.
That's correct. We are disturbing the buffer in the northerly portion of the property. You can see that green triangle that's right under the word Adelphia.
Yep.
And that's generally being disturbed because of the road widening that's required by Monmouth County. Adelphia Farmingdale Road is a Monmouth County road. They are requiring us to widen the road and then to install curb. And there's already a fairly steep grade change there that slopes from the road up to our property. So as we widen the road, we end up having to push that slope back to tie back in. So that's why we are...
So you're not suggesting that the road widening is the buffer disturbance. You're suggesting that the grading associated with the road widening
Correct.
necessitates the relief, correct?
Correct.
Okay, because the road widening is not our concern. The buffer is on their property. So to get the stable slope, you need to grade it based upon the road widening.
Correct.
Okay, but you do still need that relief, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Now, we're an issue. Could we slide the cemetery back and maintain the 50-foot buffer there?
No, we'd have to put a retaining wall.
Okay. All right, so, Mr. Siv, if I recall from the last hearing and the comments, we had agreed to do additional plantings and filling in that area, if I recall, or am I thinking of something else?
That's correct. I believe we agreed to stake out the limits of clearing so that we know where they are in the field. And then even post-clearing, if there's opens and gaps in the 50-foot buffer area, we agreed to work with Sherry to fill in those gaps with the appropriate landscaping.
And, I know this also goes into planning, it also goes into design, but from a civil and engineering standpoint, buffering is to shield one use from another, correct?
Provides a visual screen, yes.
So in this instance, the activity on this site, it's pretty low-impact activity. Would you agree as opposed to churches are permitted in this, right?
There is approval for a house of worship on this site, which will obviously be more intense than this type of use that's proposed as a cemetery.
So, but, is it fair to say cemeteries are a pretty quiet use as uses go?
Correct.
You might have people come when there's a burial, but for the most part, it's just like open space, almost like a park, like some of the older ones.
That's correct.
All right, thank you. I have no further questions for Mr. Siv.
Thank you. Board members?
Yes, I'm sorry.
No. Board members? Anyone have any more questions for Mr. Siv?
I do, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
Mr. Siv, are you familiar with any of the World Health Organization's recommendations on cemeteries? And
We have an expert who will address those issues. I mean, Mr. Sivo, obviously you asked him, he'll answer that whether he does or not, but we have an expert here tonight who is a toxicologist and will address those issues.
Okay.
If you want to wait for that, but I don't know if Mr. Siv knows that or not. That's a fair question for him.
I'm not sure what specific conditions or requirements, but I'm going to say probably not.
Okay, I've done some reading in preparation for this meeting. World Health Organization paper, The Impact of Cemeteries on the Environment and Public Health. Their recommendations go into that human remains must not be buried within 250 meters, which is about 820 feet, from any well, borehole, or spring which potable water is drawn. Does your design meet that recommendation?
Doesn't meet that recommendation, no.
Okay.
But I'm not familiar with that particular study either.
They also said place of interment should be at least 30 meters or 98 feet from any other spring or water course and 10 meters from any and all field drains. Does your plan meet that recommendation?
So the first one was,
Place of interment, so the plot,
right,
should be at least 30 meters or 98 feet from any other spring or water course
I do believe we meet that.
and 10 meters from any field drains.
Field drains, like a septic field, we would comply with that.
Okay. The field, when it's completed, it'll be maintained?
The plot?
Yes.
Yes,
The whole cemetery in itself?
yes,
It'll be mowed?
correct.
It'll be fertilized?
I don't know how they'll manage the lawn care, and that's between the operator and the lawn service on what type of fertilizers or how they manage that.
Do you know if there's a plan in place to take that into consideration as far as fertilize running into the watershed?
There is a plan in place on how to maintain the cemetery. I think it's a question for the operator for when he comes.
So is the operator coming, or is there like a cemetery expert coming?
We have our client, Mr. Schwartz, but we do not have the operator. That has not been determined at this point. the actual-
So then I would advise that your client is going to need to address these concerns.
Well, if there's
I
concerns
mean,
about
this,
fertilizing.
clearly there is, and this is a use variance, and so you need to be prepared to provide this testimony.
And also, Mr. Jackson, one of your witnesses at a prior meeting testified that animals die on the property and they deteriorate into the ground, and it's not an issue. I'm not sure which one of your
Mr.
witnesses.
Schwartz, I believe, said that.
Mr. Schwartz. If
I
500
think he
plus...
gave that as, for example, animals die.
Yes. If 500 plus animals died and were deteriorating on the ground that is being described here, would that be of concern to the DEP that you just recently mentioned?
You would have to ask the DEP that.
Would you think?
I don't know what the
If you
DEP
had mass
does or doesn't do with
deterioration
it.
going on simultaneously, would that be of more concern?
Well, I don't know that there would ever be 500 bodies buried at one time. That would be an extraordinary thing.
As the cemetery fills up, I would imagine
It
it
might
will.
take years.
True.
And if animals were buried and wrapped in linen and put in the ground in a pine box, that would be the identical circumstance that's been going on since the dawn of time, and in
Yes.
this country certainly since colonial times. And the DEP has not had an issue with that as of now in 2024 by all accounts.
So does the
I-
DEP regulate this? Because it's my understanding that they don't.
They do not. The question was whether I thought the DEP...
I understand, but they don't, that's my
I don't know.
question, is does the
I'm sorry?
DEP regulate this? And it's my understanding that they don't.
The question to Mr. Siv was whether he's aware of any DEP regulations that regulate cemeteries, and his answer was no.
I understand
And
that.
I think that's also the consensus of the board's professionals as well. There are no DEP regulations that I'm aware of that concern cemeteries, and our point in bringing out that testimony is this has been going on since the dawn of time. It's not an environmental issue, and that's what our toxicologist is going to testify
Mr.
to.
Jackson,
I don't hear where that's...
right here.
Oh, right in front, okay.
So, World Health Organization, World War I, World War II, the meat grinders, the wars, the burying of bodies, this and that. The study comes out of, from experience. That's what
I don't know the
conclude.
scientific basis of that. I
Yes.
haven't been provided with it. I don't know.
We haven't had world wars here in years' history from the beginning of time that has mass graves that are being examined over a period of time to determine whether it's an effect or not effect. That's all I'm
Right.
saying.
Yeah, and like I said, with that particular report, we have not been provided with that. I'm not familiar with the, the controls that was taken under. I don't know, we can't cross-examine those people. So we're answering the question as it comes up, but I don't know that is something that would govern this circumstance. And respectfully, there have been incidents in this country historically where there have been thousands of people buried in a short period of time. I don't know whether there were any studies about the groundwater on that. I don't know what kind of monitoring they did after Gettysburg and events like that. However, this is not an incident where it would be expected that all the graves would be at once. We have a cemetery here a couple hundred feet away, and you're going to hear testimony from the toxicologist that it's just not an issue. It never has been. You look at, drive around, there's church cemeteries that adjoin residential properties. There's cemeteries on top of hills and along riverbeds throughout this country, throughout the area. We're going to put some exhibits in. And the fact, to your point, Ms. Beam, that the DEP has not regulated this, in my experience as an attorney that does land use law, the DEP is pretty inquisitive when it comes to things that could be an environmental issue. And I respectfully submit it speaks volumes that they never have regulated this. They've never looked into it, and there's no statute or anything or any study in New Jersey by any governmental entity, no municipality, the county board of health, et cetera. There's cemeteries everywhere. Nowhere has there ever been in New Jersey any governmental concern about decomposing bodies. And when you hear the testimony from our toxicologist, I think you'll see why. It's a very, very minimal impact. There are, just by way of showing what the testimony is going to be, there are microbes. We decompose very quickly, and there are microbes in the soil that make us from ashes to ashes and dust to dust. And they'll talk about what the human composition is, et cetera. We are temporal, and decomposing bodies are, it's just, well, you're going to hear from the toxicology.
Well, we take a
I
look
hope
at.
I've answered the
Yeah, well, we
question.
take a look at Pottersfield, COVID, the pandemic, 6 deep, right? Digging deep and everything, but it's alongside the East River, and that's where, it's decomposing and going into the river, which is a large body of water. It's not necessarily the drinking water of New York City, since they are provided with reservoirs that come from upstate. The third tunnel is in, and that's all their drinking water. So it's a difference, of where you're at, how it's done, and what does it affect. That's
Our
all.
toxicologist will address that.
Okay.
I think he's going to address that particular situation as well,
Okay.
some studies that he's reviewed.
I just want to clarify my role in this is that the current DEP does not opine on cemeteries that are regulated under the Cemetery Act and under Health and Human Services. So I'm not saying that they've chosen not to act, I'm just saying they have no regulatory authority. So I just want to clarify that for the record.
And there's a state board of cemeteries and cemetery control. It is something that is regulated by the great state of New Jersey. Never been an environmental issue raised.
Okay.
Did you
Charlie?
say- I'm sorry, did you say there were no studies done of your?
Our toxicologist will address that. There have been, and he's going to address some of them. The flaws, the advantages, the ones he agrees with, doesn't agree with, et cetera. He'd be the better authority to address that.
Okay.
All right, so I'm looking at the consumer affairs that you're referring to. So section 1344J95, an operator shall only accept for cremation the descendants' remains if they are in a casket or container that is totally enclosed, rigid, has no evidence of leaking, and made up of materials that will not emit hazardous or toxic elements upon combustion. So they do regulate it to some extent through the consumer affairs. DEP perhaps may not have a specific, but it is regulated.
We meet the regulatories for this type of religious cemetery. It goes in the pine, there's a pine box, as was explained by Mr. Schwartz, and that is in accordance with state regulations. It is a religious matter as well, which I think has some significance.
Mr. Chair, if I could just ask a clarifying question to Mr. Siv. So
Yes.
you talked about the topography of Adelphia Farmdale Road from West Farms Road, generally sloping west to east towards Marshbog Brook, towards the rail lines. And there's also a high point on this site, right, towards the southwest portion of the site, is there not?
Correct, that's what I mentioned, yes.
And does that portion of the site flow in a westerly direction to the residential properties to the west of the site?
It'll flow in a westerly direction, but it will end up back into the east onto the Marshbog Brook,
So,
within a wooded portion of the properties.
so was your testimony, though, that groundwater hydrology typically follows the overland topography?
Correct.
And the properties to the west are lower than at least a portion of the rear portion of your property, the southwest portion of the cemetery plot, correct?
The southwest portion, yes.
Okay, so I just want to make that point of clarity. And then to Mr. Ryan's point, he talked about the World Health Organization. I think the last one was, you said 10 meters to like a drain? What was that last? Just want to make sure I have that correct.
Place of interment should be at least 30 meters, 98 feet from any other spring or watercourse, and 10 meters from any field drains.
So, field drains is kind of like a broad term. I think going back historically, there wasn't a lot of stormwater management infrastructure that was provided for these type of cemetery-type uses going back in time. The applicant is proposing 3 stormwater management basins on the site, which does promote, infiltration, elevation into the groundwater table to function properly. Can you tell us if your site plan complies with that 10-foot or 10-meter setback to your, from the closest plots to your infiltration basins on the site?
The closest plots to the basin are about 10, I'm going to say 10 feet to the basin,
Okay.
So it doesn't comply then?
with these 30 meters from us.
Even 10 meters. 10 meters is 32, 33 feet.
Correct, correct.
So when he asked you if you complied with that, you said yes, but in fact, you don't.
No, I asked him if he meant a drain field being a septic field. I said we can comply. I didn't know what he meant by a drain field. I thought he was talking about septic fields. That's what I agreed with.
So if we apply that term to the stormwater management basin, it would be 10 feet and not 30 feet plus or minus?
Correct.
Okay. Now, for the applicant to comply with that, what would that mean? It would mean you'd have to reduce the number of plots to increase the separation for the stormwater infrastructure on the site?
To comply with the separation distance, correct, you'd either reduce the number of plots or what has been done for septic systems. Again, it's not for a detention basin, but a lot of times what you've seen with septic fields that cannot comply with certain separation distances is you'll put like a plastic barrier or some type of barrier to help reduce that separation distance.
Okay. And then the last question that I have, and I don't know if you're the one that would have this answer, so you alluded to the existing cemetery to the northwest of this site. Do you have any idea of how many plots are on that cemetery versus what's being contemplated with this development proposal?
I do not.
Okay.
Might have an arrow that
That's
shows
all I
that.
have right now, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Kelly?
Yes.
So, at the first meeting, the planner made a point that the township council approved this to come forward, but that's not necessarily true. The town council had just approved the applicant to submit an application to the zoning board. It's not that the council approved it.
Correct. It does not, the zoning board still needs to go through their process. The state statute requires that the applicant first go to council to see if it's, because they have part of the jurisdiction, but that's not your zoning, that's not this part of it. You still have to do your land use review.
Okay,
Correct.
thank you.
So what exactly did the town council approve?
So if I could jump in, the council approved a resolution allowing them to make an application.
Thank you.
That's it. They did not opine on the merits of the case, nor support it or object to it. It was simply, can we make an application? And the answer is yes.
Thank you.
Okay,
Mr. Chair?
yes.
Mr. Jackson, do we know what year the Evergreen Cemetery was established? I might have just shut it off. It must have been on that whole time. Do we know the year the Evergreen Cemetery was established?
Mr. Chairman, may I don't. To answer your question, I'm doing two things at once, but yes, if I know when the other cemetery was established, I do not.
Okay.
I have the resolution of the council. I thought I had attached it to my PowerPoint from last time. I think it's part of the record. I'd like to read that into the record, what the council actually said about that.
Go ahead.
It's a public document.
The relevant section is in the middle of the resolution R23-270, whereas Third Avenue sent correspondence to Howell Township dated May 5th, 2023, requesting township consent to the development of Block 219, Lot 13 in Howell Township as a licensed cemetery. So this was a request for consent, whereas after consideration of the Mayor and Township Council and finding no objections to developing the property as a licensed cemetery, now there be resolved that the Mayor and Council state as follows. A licensed cemetery may be established on the property subject to the Township of Howell planning or zoning approval. Third, shall obtain all required municipal, county, state, and New Jersey Cemetery Board approvals. The mayor and manager are authorized to exercise all such documents and instruments necessary to effectuate the terms of this resolution. So I respectfully submit, I didn't read the whole thing, and I left out some lot and blocks, et cetera, but I characterize this as the township's consent, and of course, it is subject to land use approval, but I respectfully submit that this is the council's approving the request of the applicant to put a cemetery here, as is required by state law, and the council has submitted. This will speak for itself, and we'll make that part of the record. I'll submit that, and the board can draw its own conclusions on what that means.
Mr. Chair, I just want to point out that, not to take too much from the word consent, the statute itself uses that word, says a cemetery shall not be established or enlarged in any municipality without first obtaining the consent of the municipality by resolution. I think what Ms. Beam said is correct, that they need to, that was the statutory language that had to be in the resolution. That's what it requires in order to allow them to go forward and come to this board. So I don't know that the consent had any special meaning, except it was copied out of the statute.
Thank you, ma'am. Okay.
I think the point is that the council could have said this is not the right place for a cemetery.
Respectfully, I don't agree with your assertion on the determination. I mean, the council gave you the opportunity to present to this board.
Yes, and the council...
They're not opining one way or the other whether they're supportive of not or not.
Respectfully, the council consented to this as being...
I think that Ms. Carey described that language, and we're going to just agree to disagree.
We will.
So at the end of the day, the governing body did not opine one way or the other on the merits of this case. It was, you're free to make an application to this board, subject to, as you read, all the local ordinances, which goes to this board. So
with all due respect, if I may respond to that, Mr. Chairman, this is a circumstance where there was a proposal to the council. The council, representing the body politic, had every right to vote yes or no, as you do. But I respectfully submit it is significant that the council consented to this. The council could have said no. The council is the same council that approves the land use regulations. The council
Mr. Chair, I think we've beat this horse to death, but I'm here to tell you that representing the township as well as both boards, the township gave them the opportunity to make the application.
And that's what we have in front of us.
And that's exactly where we're at. So we can agree to disagree, and we can deal with it at a later date, but at the end of the day, the council did in no way offer up their support for this approval before you. They said they had to come to you to get whatever approvals are necessary, and that's how the council has addressed this issue.
Okay.
My silence, just I don't want to have point counterpoint. You've heard my point on that.
We're good. We're good.
Okay, thank you. On behalf of the four objectors, just one point in terms of this issue. The governing body resolution was for a licensed cemetery. Not clear whether this will be a licensed cemetery. If it's a religious cemetery, then it's exempt from the...
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, is this the time for cross-examination or conclusion or legal argument? This is not the objector's opportunity to address that. There may be an appropriate time for that.
And I will start my question. I want to raise that point of clarification for the board.
This isn't a trial where you have arguments and motions in the middle, otherwise we'll be here for weeks. I'd request that we stick to cross-examination. If there's legal argument at an appropriate time, counsel can make it.
You got it, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Do you have your next witness here?
I have questions for this witness.
You have questions
Yes,
for this
I do.
witness? Okay.
Wanted to, first of all, share with the board, these are portions of the CREST Stormwater Management Report. And I wanted to question Mr. Siv about these. What would we want to mark these as?
He's got
The
it.
first document will be P2.
P2? Okay.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, thank you.
While we're passing things out, I have one more exhibit. You may as well do that.
This will be P3.
And this is Mr. Siv's product?
This is going to be another item from CREST this is from the environmental impact report.
Thank you.
We better read it fast. Well, then say that I didn't prepare it. This is, picked up everything.
Yeah.
Behind you tonight.
Other witness here, yes.
I'll take that.
So the first exhibit that we distributed is what number?
P2.
P2. Second one is P3?
P3.
Okay.
Just so you understand why I said.
Hey, Mr. Siv, we've given you a copy of P2. I don't know whether you've had a chance to review that previously, but could you take a look at it now?
Okay.
And I'm going to refer you to page 2 of P2. You take a look at that. According to this report, and this is a CREST Environmental Stormwater Management Report, correct?
It is a stormwater management report.
And it's the revised June 27th, 2024, correct?
Correct.
And on page 2 of this report, does it indicate that the seasonal high water table is between 48 inches and 120 inches?
Yes, it does.
And does it indicate that the soils have a permeability of 1.6 inches per hour to 6.5 inches per hour?
Yes, it does.
Mr. Schwartz indicated in his testimony back in July that the bodies are going to be buried at a depth of 6 feet in pine boxes. Is that correct?
I believe that's what he said.
So they're not being buried in vaults, correct?
Correct?
Not being buried in caskets,
I believe they are in wooden caskets.
wooden caskets, not metal caskets.
That's my understanding, correct?
With the bodies being buried at 6 feet and the seasonal high water table in some areas, in some instances being 40 inches, there are going to be situations in which the bodies will be in the groundwater, correct?
I don't believe so, no.
How is that?
Because in the areas where the groundwater is 48 inches, we're actually filling the site. So we're bringing in fill to raise the final elevation so that we're above the natural grade where it is today.
So the bodies will not be buried in the groundwater itself, is what you're saying?
That is correct.
Have you determined whether any construction work, the construction of the stormwater management system will in any way disrupt the groundwater flow?
We have done the required analytics and analyzing of the site to meet the NJDEP requirements, part of which is the mounding analysis, and we comply with those rules and regulations.
Have you done any analysis of what the impact of the construction of the actual graves will have on the flow of groundwater?
Again, being that we are proposing the caskets and plots to be above the groundwater, we don't anticipate any, but I'm not sure what specific construction activity you're referring to.
Well, the excavation of the individual plots for the graves. Have you done any studies to determine whether or not that's going to have any impact on the groundwater?
I have not done a study on that, but again, the plots and caskets will be above the groundwater, so they're not anticipated to be in it.
If you look up at the diagram, and I'm not sure which this was identified previously, it's up on the screen, and actually I'll refer you to as well Exhibit P3, which is the crest diagram. It's the crest drainage area map. If you look at the lower left-hand corner, there is a basin, detention basin, correct?
That's correct.
And there's an overflow of that detention basin over to, we'll say, the left side here.
Correct.
And isn't it true that there is a residence in the area where that overflow is?
The residence you're referring to is to the, I'll call it the north or the top of that sheet?
There's a residence, it's lot 1302
That'd be 1301 you're referring
and
to?
1301.
Correct, and that stormwater discharges to the west, and it'll actually loop around and go into the bog, the Marsh Bog Brook to our east.
So it's not going to go, your testimony is it will not in any way impact 1301, which is right next to it.
Correct, 'cause I have the Monmouth County aerial topo that shows that we are, the drainage is heading in a south to southeast direction.
Are you familiar with, there's a Baltimore County Department of Environmental Protection white paper entitled Health Implications of Green Burials. Are you familiar with that at all?
I am not.
The report recommends that...
Chairman?
Yes.
I have a question I'm going to be asking about
Yeah,
that.
and I have an objection. And I know the rules of evidence do not apply, but the board can certainly take its cues from the rules of evidence. And the rules of evidence do not allow a witness to testify and be cross-examined on a document that the expert did not rely upon and does not know about. And it doesn't provide an opportunity for the witness to read into the record a document that has not been substantiated. That is a deprivation of due process, and it's a violation, which translates to fair procedure, because I cannot cross-examine that document. I don't know who wrote it. I don't know who funded them. I don't know what the purpose of it was. So you can't backdoor the testimony in the form of a question to a witness who says he's not familiar with that.
So with that in mind, I'd ask that the board not allow this area of inquiry.
Ms. Carey?
Mr. Bonanno, you do have an expert coming up as well.
We have an expert coming up as well.
Can we address that with him, and he can, I think that would be the appropriate way to do this.
Well, I'd like to, this was
If you have a
actually-
general, if you have certainly more general questions for Mr. Siv, that's appropriate, but if you're going to bring in the
I'm actually
document.
following up on one of the questions that was raised by Mr. Ryan in terms of the nature of the study that's been done by Mr. Siv and maybe by the next witness as well in terms of the individual,
Okay,
the elements of the study.
And he's indicated he hasn't read it, so he's not familiar, so I don't believe he's going to be able to answer your question.
Well, let
So
me
why don't we
re-
bring it in,
let me-
why don't we bring it in with your expert, okay?
Can I rephrase the question then?
Yeah.
In your study, in your analysis of the impact that the groundwater, that the cemetery development would have on the groundwater in this area, have you looked at the density of the burials and the potential impact of the buried remains on groundwater quality?
No.
Mr. Bonanno?
Have you looked at the existing and proposed wells and septic systems on or within 200 feet of the property line and existing proposed structures?
Yes, as previously testified, I went to the Monmouth County Health Department, obtained the records that they had available to us, and used that information appropriately.
Mr. Bonanno?
Yes,
That Baltimore study you said,
yes.
what organization was that?
It's it was a study, and our expert will be testifying about that. It was give me a moment. It's entitled Environmental Health Implications of Green Burials, a white paper, and it was prepared for the Baltimore County Department of Environmental Protection and Sustainability.
Okay, thank you.
Give me a moment, I can give you the year.
Mr. Chair, could I just ask a clarifying question?
Go ahead,
for Mr. Siv?
please.
So,
2015 or 2016?
Mr. Siv, one question about the depth of seasonal high water table, right? Your report says it ranges from 48 inches to 120 inches?
Correct.
So the 48 inches, those generally tend to be for the test pits that you performed around the eastern portion of the site near the wetlands and the Marsh Rock Brook, is that accurate?
That is correct.
And then the ones that you performed at the southwest corner of the site, those test pits indicated that groundwater was not encountered, generally.
I believe all the test pits that groundwater was not encountered, and the 48 inches came from seasonal high indicators.
Yeah, but for 5 and 6, I don't think that seasonal high water table or modeling was encountered, and the test pits were done to a depth of 120 inches, and that's...
Correct.
Okay. So, and you said you're filling the site in the vicinity of where the test pit showed that seasonal high water were at 48 inches.
Correct.
So, and generally, for the site layout, your stormwater basins are located around the perimeter of the site. Did you do any test pits interior to the site where you may be matching existing grade?
We have not.
Okay.
The elevation rises from east to west, and as we get farther away from the, God bless you,
But would
the
you...
low area of the site, we would expect the water table to be the deeper or the...
But to some extent, groundwater table separation from ground surface should roughly follow the topographic elevation of the surface land, correct?
That's one of the things it can do. As it usually gets closer to its low point, it generally kind of levels out. Yes, that's not
Okay.
you
So
can do that.
towards the center of the site where you're matching, your finished grade is roughly very close to the existing topographic grade. You didn't do any test pits there to see what the seasonal high water table...
That is correct.
Okay. Just wanted to clarify that for the board's
And we'd
consideration.
be more than happy to do some additional test pits if that's needed.
Chairman, in the interest of whatever,
Can we hear from the experts? Because we're talking around the experts and we're keep referring
Yes.
to. Let's start here.
We should probably let him finish his cross-examination.
I have two more questions and then,
Okay.
yeah. Mr. Sibb, would your assessment of the groundwater flow from the Evergreen Cemetery be any different if you had information that the cemetery's recent burials in the last, whatever, 25, 30 years were in vaults and not so-called natural burials?
My stormwater analysis was strictly based on analyzing stormwater runoff. It has no bearing on what's under the ground.
So you're not making any judgment in terms of the, any potential impact on the quality of the groundwater, any contamination of groundwater from Evergreen Cemetery?
Correct.
The Marsh Bog Brook is on the perimeter of the site, right?
It is to the east of our site, correct?
And you indicated that at least an aspect of the groundwater flow on the site is toward the Marshbrook Creek?
That's what we would expect, is what I said.
And the Marshbrook Creek is a tributary of the Manasquan Reservoir, correct?
It is a tributary of the Manasquan River, which ties in, the Marsh Bog Brook ties into the Manasquan River downstream of the Manasquan Reservoir. So we're downstream of where it would tie into.
But it is a source. The Marshbrook Creek is a source of the reservoir, correct?
Again, I believe it's a source of the Manasquan River south of where the reservoir is. So I don't believe it's a source of the reservoir, just based on some mapping that I looked at.
Okay, I have nothing further.
Thank you. Mr. Jackson, is
Yes, sir.
here?
Yes.
Can we get him sworn in, please?
Thank you. With your permission, I'd like to call Dennis Stankin, Ph.D.
Okay, we're going to take 5 minutes. Eileen?
While he's getting ready, may I pass out his curriculum vitae or resume?
Sign it, yes.
Thank
you. Okay.
The board will now take a 5-minute break and reconvene at 8:09 p.m.
Eileen, please call the meeting back to order.
The meeting will now reconvene.
Mr. Jackson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With your permission, if I can call Mr. Dennis Stankin, Ph.D., Princeton Somerset Group, as an expert in the field of health, toxicology, and environmental engineering and analytical sciences.
If we can get him sworn in on the record, please.
Raise your right hand, please. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give in this matter is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yep.
Can I state and spell your name, your last name for the record, please?
Dennis Stankin. It's Stainken.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Stankin, can you please tell the board, what is your profession?
Sometimes I'm not sure. I'm a toxicologist, but I'm also an analytical
Can you
chemist.
speak into the microphone, please?
Excuse me. I'm a toxicologist, but I'm also trained in medical physiology, analytical chemistry, and environmental sciences. So,
Can you please give the board the benefit of your educational background that
Sure.
led you to that area of expertise?
had a bachelor's in biology from Wagner College and an MS and PhD from Rutgers in environmental, excuse me, physiology and analytical chemistry. But I did all the doctoral work when I was in the United States EPA.
Yeah, we'll accept your qualifications, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to put his full credentials on the record because this is going to be a case of which experts the board believes and does not believe perhaps, and I think it would be beneficial for the board to know.
Mr. Jackson,
the
it's
full
already,
credentials.
it's already in, we have it.
It is, and I'd like to explore some of it, so I don't want to, disregard your admonition to move it along, but at the same time, I'd like to establish his authority in this area.
You know, Mr. Jackson, that can go two ways, right? One, it's bounced around. it's all over the place, various things. But if you want to touch on every one of these, experiences that Dr. Stankin has, go right ahead.
So, Doctor, you said you had your PhD, and I'm sorry, you were saying where you did most of your doctoral studies? Or most of your doctorate?
Yeah, well, the pertinent items is that I was in the US EPA in charge of analytical methods development. Most of the analytical methods they use today in all the environmental monitoring and safe drinking water monitoring are methods that came through our laboratory. I'm one of the co-authors of the Oil and Gasoline Fingerprinting Handbook.
You have to speak up.
I'm sorry.
That prism on the table is the microphone. I can barely hear you here, so I can guarantee you the people in the back room cannot hear you at all.
Okay. Anyway, within the US EPA, I worked on quite a few different method developments from different sources. We were looking for formaldehyde, hazardous waste. Different studies at that time during the 1970s and 80s were looking for sources of contamination. One of them happened to be cemeteries, but that was from ancient and old cemeteries down in the south because they often used lead coffins, and some of them had density, what we call multiple use, where they put body on top of body over time that were embalmed with formaldehyde, so you could see that sometimes in the groundwater.
Thank you to President Nixon for establishing the Environmental Protection Agency.
Okay.
Go ahead, sir.
But
Speaking of state governmental agencies, I'll just, with the chairman's comments in mind, and this has been marked into the record, correct? The 11-page resume, what's the exhibit number on that?
A18, correct.
18, thank you. Mr. Chairman, the board will review that. I just want to touch on a couple of the highlights. I'll move it along. I see from 85 to 90, you were the Bureau Chief of Quality Assurances for the State of New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. Can you please explain what that was?
yeah, the Quality Assurance Office and the DEP between 1985 and 90, we codified all the analytical methods that are now used for drinking water in the state. For environmental analyses, and also it was and still is a laboratory certification program. I also did a lot of internal affairs work and a lot of research work because many of the things that were happening during that time were innovative and new contaminants coming out. I was involved originally in the Ciba-Geigy outfall study. Later on, the Toms River brain cancer study, I was involved in that. In fact, it was my work that actually fingered the Ciba-Geigy effluent into the Toms River well field. And a lot of the research that we did at the time was, again, developing new analytical methods, but also troubleshooting, because any data coming into the Department of Water or any of the remediation offices had to be evaluated. So we had to make sure that the methods worked. And a lot of times, if there were questions on the data, we had to determine whether it's the sampler, the lab, or sometimes a criminal activity by some of the permittees.
So proof of principle was in order, and then once you found that you had proof of principle, you invoked it, yes?
Yep.
Okay.
You had experience with the biologist, chemist, physical scientist with the United States Department of Environmental Protection.
Yep.
Can you please explain what that was and what you did for them?
Within the US EPA, I had the analytical methods development section for hazardous waste, oil and gasoline, most of your contaminant chemicals, but also we had quite a few contracts out and studies going on for development of biodegradation. When you go back into the field of environmental contamination treatment, there's waves of what's in vogue. For a while it was burn it, then it was bury it, then it was biodegrade it. I had, behind the scenes, wrote quite a few of the contracts and was a contract reviewer for a lot of that work. Plus, we did a lot of it in Edison. And Part of that was to develop also whether or not for some of the hazardous waste sites in Superfund we could use biodegradation or in some types microbe amendment to try and expedite biodegradation of compounds.
Have you had any teaching positions as a college professor?
Yeah, I've taught medical physiology in several colleges. I've taught biology and physiology at Rutgers, Manhattan College. A lot of environmental courses at Manhattan College, toxicology.
So, and they are all listed on your CV, correct? Such as
Yeah.
human anatomy, human physiology, comparative physiology, et cetera.
Right.
All right, so those are all the questions I'll have. Thank you for your indulgence. I just wanted to highlight a couple of them, but there's 11.
Well, I would like to ask many a question now,
By all means.
I'm teasing you, but Superfund sites and everything else that came out of the 70s into the 80s was a big deal in this country. And, there's been a lot of remediation going on, and not all of it's been complete. So.
Now, I still work for the Attorney General's office on certain types of fraud recovery cases.
Yes. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Jackson.
So, Doctor, have you performed any studies or analysis specifically related to human decomposition in various settings?
Yeah, actually, I've had, in the course of doing toxicology work and personal injury, I've had different criminal cases. I had to evaluate the last supposed murder victim of Nurse Cullen, the mass murderer. Someone thought that one of their relatives was a victim, so 10 years after he was killed or died, the corpse was exhumed. We had to evaluate that in an autopsy. I've had projects, one of them was Naval Criminal Investigation Service, NCIS, the fate of a corpse. Somebody thought one of the petty officers had been murdered and dumped into the fuel tank of a tanker. And the Seton Hall fire, all those victims, the 3 kids, I had to determine as part of a lot of the different work that went on, I had to determine the time of death and the actual manner of death. I've had cases of drowning where you had to determine whether or not they was accidental or intentional. I've had a variety of poisoning cases. Were they really poisoned? Was it accidental overdose? Was it a medical overinjection? Those are not quite like TV, but they're pretty interesting.
Have you had any occasion to study decomposition and what happens to the body as it decomposes, particularly in the setting of a ground burial in the earth?
So, Mr. Chair, before we get to that, does the objecting attorney have any questions about his qualifications?
No, I have no qualification questions.
Thank you.
Well, in terms of corpse decomposition and toxicology, one of the things that goes on quite a bit is determining basically what comes out of the human body, how does it dissolve. And you'll find that there's probably 2 venues where myself and people are mostly interested in, and one is if a corpse is left on the surface, there's one manner of decomposition, and you'll find one body of literature where, and it's still an active study, there's different groups around the world that have permission to lay out corpses, and they watch them dissolve. And the object is to determine underneath the corpse, are there a body of chemicals vertically in a zonation that we can identify relative to the rate of decomposition of the corpse that would give us time of death, what they call a post-mortem interval, how long has he been dead here. In the other approach in which they use buried bodies, there are also another bunch of human experiments going on around the world on that. The bulk of that type of data has actually been using pigs. Pigs metabolically are quite identical to the manner that we decompose. And once again, the object is from the analytical chemistry side to come up with methodology and evaluation of the zonations underneath the corpses, to see just exactly how the body eventually decomposes, disappears, and again, is there a way to relate that to the time of death or the time of burial of the individual?
So that said, there are studies and there are reasons for forensics, et cetera, why different entities, different groups have actually done scientific tests on some of this stuff,
Yeah.
on decomposition. So in connection with preparing tonight, did you prepare a bibliography of some of the materials that you've reviewed and rely on in being prepared for tonight?
Yeah.
And is
just
this that
pro-
bibliography?
Right, that's just a quickie. I mean,
A quick of some of the things. So
there are hundreds of articles on this.
with your permission, Mr. Chairman, if I can mark this and
Did you already mark
make it part of the record?
Yeah.
Okay.
A19.
19.
Well, he did.
Yeah.
We're good?
A19.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Dr. Stankin, just, Mr. Chairman, it might be faster if I just read some of these into the record to go over and say, are these some of the articles that you...
Please do, because we're sharing here.
Thank you, and that will probably go faster. Regarding corpse decomposition, stages of decomposition, Australian Museum, corpse decomposition, you looked at Wikipedia, dust to dust, eventual afterlife by Avard Voss, 2010, chemical process of decomposition, you reviewed Wikipedia for that. Is that's all correct?
Yeah, those are the simpler ones.
So in section 2, chemicals and soils beneath human decomposition. Luong, monitoring the extent of vertical and lateral movement of human decomposition products through sediment using cholesterol as a biomarker, Forensic Science International, 285-93, page 93 through 104. Is that one of the articles you reviewed?
Yeah.
And is that the type of article that, people with PhDs and in the field, like you said, that do forensics, is that the type of thing that you review to, see what the other doctors are saying about this type of...
Yeah, we use these as the basis for how we'll set our own sampling.
Caballero, Moreno, 2024, lipoderms and cadaver decomposition and determination of the postmortem interval, systematic review, International Journal of Molecular Science, 25, page 984. Is that one?
Yep.
An evaluation of soil chemistry and human cadaver decomposition, islands, potential for estimating postmortem interval, PMI, Forensic Science International, 279. That's one. Taylor, soil elemental changes during human decomposition. Fiedler, 2023, cadaver imprint on soil chemistry and microbes, knowns, unknowns, and prescriptives, frontiers in soil sciences. Are those some of the articles that you've reviewed?
Yep.
Regarding microbes and pathogens, microbial diversity, the fate of pathogenic bacteria buried in cadavers, Journal of American Medical Association, 2005. Morgan O., infectious disease, risk of dead bodies following natural disasters. Reverend Panem Salud Publica, Van Wyck et al., potential SARS-CoV contamination of groundwater as a result of mass burial. A minute review, Science of Total Environmental. Thomas, microbial diversity of septic tank effluent in a soil biomat, applied in environmental microbiology. American Society of Microbiology, 2022, human body alters soil microbiome after death, decomposition. Just a couple more. Parkinson, 2009, microbial community analysis of human decomposition in soil. Yates, 1988, modeling microbial fate in the subsurface environment, critical reviews in environmental science and technology. Meshke, JNS, Sabizi, MD, microbial pathogens in on-site soil treatment systems, North Carolina State Extension, Vernon James Center. Pathogens and vector attraction in sewage sludge, EPA. Taranowski, 2024, cemeteries and graveyards as potential reservoirs of antibiotic genes and bacteria review, environmental chemistry letters. SABA, ED, 2023, evaluating the impact of a cemetery on groundwater by multivariance analysis, environ assesses. And the last two, impact of cemeteries, Zukowski, 2015, impact of cemeteries on groundwater, and World Health Organization, 1998, the impact of cemeteries on the environmental and public health. Those are some of the articles that you've reviewed. Yeah.
So you've provided the board with one list of this, right? Today.
I'm going through his testimony.
That's not the question. You provided the board one list of all these things that you just rattled off at 100 miles an hour.
Well, I could read them more slowly.
No, I'm not interested in that. The question is, you provided the list, one copy today, correct?
That's correct.
So you didn't provide a copy to the objecting attorney?
I did.
You have this?
He showed me one. He only needs
Okay,
two.
but you didn't provide, like, you made multiple copies of a CV. It didn't occur to you to make multiple copies of this?
There's no requirement when you're putting an expert on to give
So,
testimony.
that's great. So we'll give the weight, the respective weight that it deserves. But I'm here to
What does
tell
that
you,
mean? You'll give it the respective weight.
Paul, if you legitimately think that I have the capability of writing that down 150 miles an hour, I don't. And I'm not interested in you repeating it slowly. I would have thought, out of respect for the board and its professionals, you would have provided the requisite copies. That's fine. I understand, you're not obligated to. You just said that on the record. That's totally
I
fine.
assure you, when the objector has his expert come up and testify, that I was not provided with the documentation.
Neither was I.
and the support
So that's
record.
totally fine.
So
But-
that is not the way this is done.
Well, it is the way it's done, but it's the way you've chosen to deal with it. And I also respect the fact that anyone who comes here on a regular basis provides this stuff digitally. So it can be broadcast on the screen so everyone in the public can see it. So I know that this is maybe the third or fourth time you've been here, but we here in Howell like things done on a USB so we can broadcast it to the public. So you're free to continue.
Yes, and Mr. Chairman, in a perfect world, that would have all been done.
I mean, not for nothing, you were carried to August 26th, you carried from them to now. That's been months.
I'm addressing the chairman. Mr. Chairman, respectfully.
Okay.
Whoa.
Mr. Chairman, there is a point of order, and I'm addressing the chair now, and if I may do so briefly.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Chairman.
For example, several board members did some research and read articles to me. I heard about them for the first time. The World Health Organization is on this. This is a unusual type of case. It's an unusual type of expertise. In a perfect world, I would have provided this. I've been here more than 3 or 4 times. You can see I prepare, I do a PowerPoint, I pass things in. For example, the stormwater management report that Mr. Siv provided. I didn't give everybody copies of that. That's in the board's record. And when an expert testifies, it's not always feasible to have everything that the expert relies upon. And you take a different tact, a different approach when you put an expert witness on how well you build their background. Now, I did not know I was going to be addressed with World Health Organization articles that I know my expert reviewed. I would normally just do this in a narrative format. But as an advocate, as an attorney who's presents cases based on the questions from the opposition, confronting Mr. Siv with articles that was never provided to me, I thought it would be appropriate for me to spend the time to go through my client's credentials and his background and some of the articles that he's relying on. Those are some of the reasons why we don't give everything every expert testifies ahead of time. Now, I appreciate Ms. Beam is schooling me on how things are done in Howell, et cetera. However, this is how it's also done in a lot of other places.
Mr. Jackson.
Thank you.
Mr. Jackson, we are on uncharted territory.
We all are.
Right? For the board members here, for the public, for the professionals, we just want to make sure that we follow procedure, process, get everything on the record so that we can make a decision. Ms. Beam is correct. You did read very quickly. Where is it at?
It's over here now.
Oh, no. Into the record. It's going to take time to digest it all. You're correct. Because we're in uncharted waters, some of the members might have done their own research to understand where this is going. It's not unusual for a board member to want to do that. They asked the questions, and and we are where we are. So I would ask that you continue with your witness. We'll hear what they have to say. We'll ask the board members if they have any questions of Mr. Stankin. And then we'll open it up to the objecting attorney for questions. Here's the other thing. It's not just the objective attorney. There's also the public that has to have public eventually at the end of this, because he's only representing 4. We're giving him the courtesy to consolidate for those 4 members, and I'm hoping that those questions and comments are satisfying the majority of the other public that's sitting out there, so that we don't have to duplicate that process. So that's where we're at, okay? And I just...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You know, it's all good.
I'm simply responding into some of the comments that Ms. Bean made, basically saying that I should have handed this in ahead of time. I read it quickly. It's very unusual in a land use board setting to have a toxicologist come in and give testimony on the decomposition of human bodies. And frankly, there's no manual on how to prepare for that. So I hope the board will give me some indulgence and latitude on that. I only have 2 copies of that with me tonight. I could probably email it. We could put it up on the screen if you'd like. I could make more copies available. But I'm doing the best I can.
Jen, would you like for us to get an email and put it up?
I mean, if the board
I think
is
that
not...
that might correct the record for...
I agree. I think that it should be submitted, and I think that, we should have an opportunity to do our own research. But if
Okay.
you're going to ask us for our opinion, there's no way I can give my opinion based on 2 pages of
Okay,
research
Eileen,
notes.
we're going to take 5. Okay.
The board will now take a 5-minute break and reconvene at 8:42, I'm sorry.
Eileen, we're back.
The meeting will now reconvene.
Mr. Jackson, thank you. The public can now see what's up on the screen. It's part of the record, it's part of the video broadcasting and so forth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome.
So I did the background and the foundation, if you will, that I wanted to. I got through the bibliography. And now, with your permission, I'd like to ask Dr. Stankin to provide his analysis of what happens during human body decomposition, and how does it affect the groundwater, how does it affect the surrounding properties.
Please proceed, yes.
Can you answer that, Doctor? And please, raise your voice and go right to the microphone.
Yeah. First off, the bibliography was just an example. I don't want you to think that that's all. As I said, there's a lot. I mean, we have textbooks on it. But getting back to the main issue of a corpse decomposing, this is an unusual issue for this, in that we're not talking about embalming. We're talking about just a body decomposing. Now, there's 2 ways that it can do it. I said earlier you can have a body laid on a surface or a body in a box in the dirt. My understanding in this scenario is that the body is going to be wrapped in a shroud and put in a pine box or a wood box. That box then is put in the dirt. So really we're talking about the decomposing of the wood, the shroud, and the body. The minute the body is dead, and they say it's brain dead and you leave it there, there's actually activity going on inside that body. As a toxicologist, that's the part that we're most concerned about, because things start moving from one part of the body to the other. They're all heading eventually to the liver. But you do find then that the body slowly, steadily drains its organs into the central body cavity. As that happens, you'll see lots and lots of references to different types of total liquids in the body, 60% of the body, 6 gallons of water. It doesn't let loose instantaneously. What happens is that as the body starts to decompose, the liquids themselves become a medium. So the blood cells lyse, the pancreas lyses, the proteolytic enzymes are let loose throughout the rest of the body cavity, and basically it's starting to digest itself. You also had the release of a lot of the microbes from the intestinal tract. And so little by little, over the next 0 to 3 days, you find that internally, the structure that was holding the body together starts to dissipate. And basically, you now have a sac, more or less, that you call the body. Strangely enough, when you look at the total composition of some of that, it's very similar to a typical fertilizer. And I always say that we're walking miracle grow. While you're alive, your chemicals are functioning and working, but once you're dead, you can become fertilizer. And there's quite a few people advocating that type of mulching and using humans. But again, the liquids will gradually reconcentrate into the central cavity. Now, the fats in the semi-liquids will start to change also. You've got aerobes still in there at this point in time, right? You've taken the body, you've sealed the body up, whatever oxygen was in the body is still stuck there, myoglobin, whatever, in some of the blood corpuscles. The body is put into a box. It's not a vacuum seal, so there's still oxygen in there. So what that means is for a while, you've still got the ability to have aerobic decomposition. That can proceed relatively quick. But as that oxygen is consumed, you now start to get the continued liquefaction of the rest of the body, the putrefaction. That's the part that you usually see in horror movies. That's the part that you may see of the deer laying on the side of the road. That's where they're starting to gradually bloat, belly up. The gases are being produced. Now, keep in mind, most of that is still happening within the box. Now, in this case, it's not a casket or a concrete vault like some people use. So it's really all going on within the void within the box. Everything is still within that box. It hasn't really gotten out of the box. And now the muscle and the bones start to gradually do very intricate changes. But in essence, you're heading towards breaking down everything into its components. And the components are going to be mostly all protein, carbohydrate, and fat and lipids. Now, even with the fats and the lipids, when the fats and the lipids get liquefied, and I don't want to be too gross about it, but if you start poking a hole and watch what's liquefied in the corpse, you'll see that a lot of the interior liquids have started to get, well, if you use your hands without rubber gloves, it'd be kind of greasy, oily, because the fatty acids are starting to break down too, and the lipids. As the oxygen is consumed, now you got to start to get anaerobic degradation. And at that point then, the body has gotten to the maximum over about 20 days of as putrefied as it's going to get. The skin will start to rupture at some point. The gases are getting out. But again, it's still in a box, right? Body in a box. The liquids now are going to start to soak into the wood under the body. So you've got now actually, in essence, a sort of a wood sponge, depending on the wood. And the body liquids aren't going to get out of that box unless they make it way through cracks. So it's not a matter of like instantaneous dump. It's a matter of a continuous seep. And that's why I said earlier that most of the studies that are done by us are looking for that zonation as the material comes out of the body and percolates down through the soils, depending what they are. That slow release is critical to allowing two things to happen: continued biodegradation of the material being released, and a start to see a change in the microbial composition. You will see at first aerobes, aerobic bacteria, and some anaerobic bacteria coming out of that body. But as those microbes, along with the liquids, start to get into the soil itself is not empty. I mean, I don't care whenever you look at soil, if you take a microscope and a little bit of water, you will find microbes in there, whether they're amoeba, paramecium, there are other groups called Bordetella, and they're pretty aggressive because they're seeing these microbes coming down into the soil as their food. They're predators. They're basically microbial predators. You also have certain types of anaerobic and aerobic bacteria that are predators also. So throughout that zonation, you're going to get the liquids come down, gradually percolating down through the pores and sort of like a pinball going back and forth through the soil particles. Some will absorb to the soil particles depending on whether cation, anion, and so will some of the viruses and the bacteria. Now, as they're sitting there, you've now got a zonation of the soil acting as a combination of a chromatography medium holding some of the stuff back as it's going through. At the same time, you're starting to develop a microbial mat. And that microbial mat is going to be the organisms that first came out of the body. And as they change and then becomes the soil organisms, it's very similar in some respects to the way septic systems work. The septic system is basically your own effluent, just that you're not dead yet. It's coming out of your cesspool, and it goes out into the septic field, the leaching field. And if you dig up those leaching fields, you'll often see microbial mats. That's one of the reasons why some of the septic systems fail, is the mat gets too thick, closes up its ability to drain. And that's one of the reasons why they say a well-managed field will last about 50 years, and don't pour greases and oils down, because that will help form that microbial mat. You get the same thing underneath the body in the box. As time goes on, the months that you're going to end up with then coming out, that zonation will be roughly about a foot underneath the box. You can then find zones as you proceed down of the more water-soluble fatty acids, the more soluble some of the proteins and stuff. They may make it down another 2 or 3 feet, but basically the most dense areas of everything are going to be in the first foot under the box, and then it's going to lens out to be 2 or 3, 4 feet down below. Rainwater, if it comes down during that process, isn't going to do too much because the mat is almost like a semi-solid. Again, you've got greases, fats, lipids, and the proteins, but the proteins are a variety of weird biological degradation products that are rearranged, so they're going to be more prone to be reactive to soil particles. Most soil particles also have its own native microbial mat on the surface of it. The net result is that you're just getting eventually complete biodegradation of the effluent coming out of the cadaver. Now, that's the first stage. Now you have the longer stage, the remaining body in the box.
How long is this first stage?
Usually not more than 20, 50 days tops, depending on what's happening in the box.
Please continue. We're about to say what the next stage is.
Well, the next stage gets to be much slower, because now what's happening is that the muscle mass has started to dry up and when I say dry up intracellularly, it's going to be become really leathery, takes much longer to biodegrade. If you've ever seen deer corpses laying around the road or animal corpses, you'll often see that at that point the skeleton starts to appear a little bit, the skin, maybe the muscles have shrunk around it. That's going to take a lot longer to degrade. That could take months to years, but it's a continuous, slow process. In the meantime, the microbial mat, depending on soil conditions, gradually will change over time too, unless it's fed with another body, which you don't do body on body here. That is a problem in other world areas where they actually do put a body on top of the body to fill the hole. That technically would have a negative effect because now you're expanding the mat. But over time, that mat will reduce in size a little bit. A lot of those nutrients will not disappear for quite a while. They'll be stuck in that zone. because you've now created a whole new microbial community. And some are growing and some are dying, and so it's just sort of feeding on itself. Now, the water-soluble components over time, like the phosphorus and the nitrogen compounds, they can laterally move, and they will over time. In the movement, which is another part of what we follow, is that that's going to depend a lot, that's going to depend a lot on the soil type, the porosity, whether or not it's silt, clay, alkaline, acid. They all affect the ionic capability of the soil particles to hold things back. The other aspect of it is that you usually don't have constant flow. Flow comes in pulses. People sometimes think of groundwater as an underground river. That's only true if you're in limestone formations with underground caves with the water flowing. Most of the time, especially in New Jersey, you have different zones of flowing. It's relatively slow in the north, in the Piedmont areas where we have shale. It's really difficult because it follows all these fracture zones. Once you get down into here, you got loamy, sandy soils. But as you go deeper, you also have clay lenses, which hold some of it back. But getting back to the concept of the zonation, that will also move in pulses. So the bulk of any lateral or downward movement is really going to come in the initial phases of degradation. After that, it's gone. There's a question about raised that I was told about the movement of bacteria and viruses. You'll see there's a lot of articles on that, and a lot of them are pro and a lot of them are con, and a lot of them sort of waffle in the middle. Those that were cited in some of the literature that I reviewed, and other people cite them, when you look at the experimental design of how they did those, they're looking at cemeteries where the bodies were physically almost sitting in water. And that was step one. Step two is that when they say they're putting in boreholes or wells, they're hand-augering holes roughly about 10 to 15 feet deep within the areas where the corpses are. So in that scenario, yeah, you would pick up stuff, especially within the first months. Some of the studies that I saw, they didn't even really get groundwater. It was a seasonal. When it rains during the rainy season, their boreholes had water. So it's difficult to make sense out of some of those. I know from experience in the DEP and quality assurance in charge of the water parts of the water program, we have what are called groundwater quality standards. And they include looking for coliforms and most of the compounds that people have expressed interest in, I guess. That requirement applies anywhere. It would apply under the cemetery. It applies to a contaminated site. It's a universal standard. So I've never seen any issues of that come in the 20-odd years that I've had to work with the Bureau of Safe Drinking Water. What I have seen come in is things like radioisotopes from radon in the north, arsenic from the arsenic green sands, and radiation from some of the soils down around Burlington. And then the Trenton water supply, which is always under attack, big problem with manganese. But getting back to the concern about the bodies and the bacteria and the viruses, one of the things to remember that, again, not everybody remembers unless you're into this, is that they're gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria. The gram-positive bacteria are the ones that are usually in humans. The gram-negative tend to be the environmental ones. The difference is that the gram-negative bacteria, being mostly environmental bacteria, are very aggressive enzymatically, and they also have a nasty tendency to form a spore or capsid naturally. That's why when you get a bacterial infection from an environmental bacteria, it's a real difficult medically to kill it. But Conversely, the gram-positive bacteria don't last very long. Once they leave their aerobic or moist semi-anaerobic environment, they die off or they're eaten. What happens with a lot of the viruses, and I heard it mentioned about COVID, there have been a couple of studies on COVID recently. One of them was in Sight. I provide a copy, or it's available, in which the COVID particles don't last either in the soil. Because of the ionic matrix of the outer envelope of the COVID virus, it has a tendency to adhere to silt clay particles. And at that point then, if there's any dryness, the capsule just breaks. So they haven't seen it. In my own life, I've had a lot of experience with looking for, let's say, infectious bacteria in different areas. I did quite a few studies of the Raritan Bay. And during that time period in the 70s and 80s, people were worried about poliovirus in all the shellfish. I was working with a microbiologist up at Fairleigh Dickinson, and he isolated quite a few different aggressive bacteria, including poliovirus. But when he tried to infect rats with it, it was non-infective. What happens with a lot of these organisms, even though you may culture it, is that they're not necessarily aggressively infective anymore. I've sampled a lot of times in sewage spills, both in houses, around houses, and there was one with a county spill out in Phillipsburg where the county sewer just drained across somebody's lawn for half a year. 2 years later, yes, I could isolate viable E. coli in the soils. The trouble is that there's a differentiation when they say E. coli. There's coliforms, which is why the quality standards say total coliforms. And then there's one called fecal coliform, which is a different test and a different species. And some of the ones like H120 and some of the others, which are incredibly infective, you just don't see. It's usually transmitted person to person or by some vegetable vector.
So, Dr. Stankin, you've indicated various pathogens, et cetera, that go into the soil, different types of microbes, et cetera. Bottom line, how long is it before the body is decomposed and it stops, whatever comes from it stops moving in the soil?
Well, the bulk of decomposition will happen within the first 6 months to a year. The remnant of the body could take as long as 10 years, depending on conditions and the body
You said this
itself.
only goes down a couple feet because of this microbe mass. I know I'm, Matt, I know I'm highly oversimplifying what you said, but that the gist of it?
Yeah, the water-soluble components can move past that. One of the problems that I've seen with some of the studies that talk about lateral diffusion of viruses and bacteria in groundwater and running around is that they're really not talking about groundwater. What they're talking about is perched water. If you think about it for a minute, and right now one of the biggest problems we have in this state is dry cleaning fluid. We call it a sinker chemically because it's heavier than water, but it's tinier than a microbe or a virus. And that does sink.
Sink.
That
Goes
does
down.
sink. That's why we call it a sinker. But viruses and bacteria are not the same as these organic chemicals. And a lot of these studies that I've seen where they say that they're finding microbes and viruses in groundwater, and most of them have been overseas type studies where I question the experimental design. But regardless, they're
What
not...
do you mean by that? You question the experimental design. I know when you get your PhD, when there's a scientific method, a lot of these studies, do they follow what an American PhD would recognize as a genuine scientific analysis? I know I'm paraphrasing, Locke. Could you just expand on that a little or explain what you said? I think you said it's questionable in its scientific approach. I'm paraphrasing.
Not really. When we started with the US EPA, we came out with contractor means for how to sample contaminated sites, how to set your wells up gradient, down gradient, at what depth to understand the flow of the water and so forth. The NJDEP went one better. We have an incredible sampling manual. It's almost step by step of setting up gradient wells, lateral side wells, depth of sampling, the screen, and so forth, so that when you're trying to evaluate contamination on a site, you're in a scenario that you can really tell, is it contamination from the site? Is it coming from off-site? Is it going off-site? So you can actually draw some types of information from it. A lot of these studies that were done elsewhere that I said don't conform is that if you're really going to try and study, let's say, what's coming out of a cemetery or a contaminated site, don't just put one down gradient well. Where's your up gradient well? Where's your side gradient well? Some of them even mention that, well, it could be coming from off-site. Well, then how do you make this conclusion? And as I said, most of them are not looking at deep wells. Now, when I say deep, typically in New Jersey, we will do hand auger looking at gasoline sites, oil tanks, things like that, maybe down to 10, 12 feet. That's can be groundwater, but realistically it's more likely just the perched groundwater. It's not where we're definitely not taking a drinking water at that depth. The majority of water wells, potable wells in New Jersey are usually down below 100 feet. A good many of them are in 200, 300 feet. It's a combination of better water and also more water, because once you're in shallow wells, you don't know what you're going to pick up. I have had cases in the past where restaurants, people got sick drinking the water in the restaurant. The restaurant had a well. When we looked, and the septic system was not 50 feet away, number one. And number two, it was in shale up in northern New Jersey, and the shale was fractured directly to the screen on their well.
Shale has fissures.
Right. So in that case, yes, the rainwater was washing the effluent from the septic field right down into the shale cracks to the drinking water well.
The roof just goes along the beam and just goes right to...
Well, again, that's why in the DEP regulations and setting wells in place and drinking water in place, we state clearly don't do that. We have regulations about 50 feet minimum distances, 150 feet minimum distances, and well casing depths.
You mentioned well casing, you mentioned fissures, you mentioned wells should be 200 feet, I think you said 150 feet. Where this effluent that you described goes, a couple feet under a 6-foot grade, over a certain period of time, would you ever expect that to get down 150 feet into a drinking well? And if so, please explain. If not, please explain.
No.
Why
not? Because number one is there's no way that the water would get to that depth from the surface unless there was actually some kind of waterfall crack. The only time those issues come up is in community wells. The state of New Jersey established a wellhead protection system years ago. It's a zone around community intake wells so that when community wells are pumping and they can suck a lot in summer.
That's because they're feeding hundreds, however many houses, however many houses.
Yeah, the community wells. And so therefore that area is designated as a radius around these community wells as a wellhead protection. And nothing's supposed to be in there, and God help you if you have any contamination in there, it will be all over you.
Residential well, is that the same?
No, the residential well standards are basically where you put them, how you screen them, the depth you screen them. The water quality standards are the same. The criteria of the list of contaminants you would look for are the same.
You mentioned several times septic fields. How does what our client proposes compare with the hazard contamination that would be from a septic field on the well, the same property as the well, the same lot as the well?
Well, in the end, again, you don't have a constant input, but hypothetically, if you took five body-in-a-boxes and laid them one next to another, and set a watch at time zero, you have basically a septic field at that point. The bodies are all gonna, they won't all degrade or explode at the same rate, some faster than others, but within bounds, you'll have the same amount of material and the same zonation and the same amount of materials that may get away. Now, the water-soluble stuff typically is nitrogen and phosphorus. And one of the things a lot of cemeteries do, and I've seen in some articles, is they plant trees and shrubs to absorb some of the nitrogen and phosphorus, which again is why humans are basically a walking fertilizer in the end.
I've been called that. So, Mr. Shiv gave testimony that the water flow is away from the home. I'm paraphrasing, you heard his testimony as well. How does that factor into your evaluation of this circumstance, of this case?
Well, the groundwater, I walked in at the end, by the way. The groundwater flow, the way I heard it, was a heading in a west to east general direction, and looking at the maps, it seems to be heading predominantly into what shows up as a vegetated area.
The Moshbog Brook.
Okay. The nitrogen phosphorus would probably eventually make its way in there. I think you'd see the marsh grass a lot greener over time. Marshes are actually used as a major filter to take out wastewater treatment material. I don't know if they still use it, but the city of San Diego, I had to, in another lifetime, design waste treatment plants. The city of San Diego actually has a complete closed-loop drinking water system. So the poops go to the waste treatment system, and then they go through a series of clarifiers and solids removal, and then the raw effluent goes through a man-made marsh, and at the end of it is the drinking water intake to the drinking water plant, where it goes back and it gets filtered out, and you have San Diegans drinking their own water. It is, in fact, I just finished for a second, it is, that approach, by the way, is also used in NASA, because when I was involved in designing waste treatment plants and stuff, it turns out that the National Space Center down in Huntsville has a whole series of experiments in which they use marshes and artificial wetlands for cleaning effluent to drinking water standards.
So, in summary, in your view, does the cemetery that our client proposes pose any risk for contamination to the drinking wells of any of the homes surrounding the cemetery?
I can't say there would never ever be a risk. That would be silly, but I would say it would be a minimal risk depending on where the well is cased and screened. If it's a shallow well, that still could be an issue. If it's a deep well that's been properly drilled, cased, and sealed, I'd say it shouldn't be an issue.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
I have a question. Mr. Stankin. DEP, New Jersey, level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, contamination levels. You're familiar with those, right?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay. So, does a cemetery that's decaying 5,000 bodies over a 20-year period, let's say, does that present a level 1, 2, 3, or 5 concern?
I'm not sure, because I don't work with the level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5s.
Okay. Go ahead.
I just wanted to clarify, you had said that 5 caskets kind of equates to a septic field, is that?
Well, it's just a crude analysis. I mean, we know that laterals, usually they'll have anywhere from 6 to 10 laterals in a typical septic field.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Stankin, the chairman asked, you stated by Mr. Jackson's question that the homes nearby are unlikely to be affected by it. But what about downstream from this brook where the water, the grade goes towards the brook and then goes towards the Manasquan River and to the reservoir area? Can you be certain that's not going to be an issue?
Normally, your groundwater goes 2 levels. When you look at the streams and the rivers, they have a bedding plane. And that bedding plane doesn't change very much with the contour of that stream unless something crazy happens, like 100-year floods every day and it scours it out. That bedding plane is also a function then of the lateral water coming in. There's always going to be a certain amount of seepage coming in from lateral in through there. Now, if that lateral seepage has to go through that marsh, I can't see anything getting through that marsh or not deposited in the mud where it would just be part of that ecosystem. It wouldn't make sense to have it suddenly dip underneath the bedding plane.
Well, what if there isn't marsh there?
That would be a different story. If you
Yeah.
had, obviously, if you just had straight right to the river, then you'd have to question whether or not the rate at which is coming in, because this is a rate function also. It's not a constant function. In other words, like the body's decomposed, but then the movement and everything else after that, there's a rate over time, because water pulses. It doesn't go in a constant wave.
Okay. Thank you.
Just for my clarification, but you said a lot of the decomposition chemicals are beneficial to the soil below or to to what's underneath the ground?
Yeah. If you look at some of the literature, for instance, in forensic, they actually call it, if you're looking at a corpse that decomposes on the surface, not buried, over time, they call it a decomposition island, because that area will be greener than the rest. It's one of a couple of, we're always looking for ways to find something. And that's a good tip-off then that something's going on that's abnormal.
Thank you.
You know,
There it is. Of all the studies or papers that you read, are any of them have anything to do with a cemetery of this size, meaning 5,400 plots?
Some of them do. Some of
What's the biggest plot?
The overseas ones. I don't remember, 10 hectares, I think.
What was that?
10 hectares? They call them hectares.
What, explain that to me, I'm sorry.
I'm not sure. It sounded like to me it would be like about 5 to 10 acres in size. These are old cemeteries, but I don't know the exact dimensions.
And of those studies that you read said there's minimal to no negative effects on on potable water?
No, the ones that were overseas, almost all of them said there was.
Right.
Except 2 or 3, I'll take that back. There were 2 or 3 of them that in the end concluded that there was no real threat, that they did identify the same type of microbial change in the soils, but they didn't see it as a threat to public health.
And why do you think there's this difference in studies or opinion?
I think it's a combination of factors. One of the studies that I read, they were using hack kits, which have a very, that they're commonly used for field work and college courses and quickie measurements, but the level of sensitivity isn't there. And again, as I explained earlier, when you put a monitoring well right next to a corpse in a box, don't be surprised that you find something. I mean, that's not really telling me anything I wouldn't have expected to be there anyway. What I'd want to see is you're upgrading, you're downgrading wells, you're side grading, and actually, if you're going to tell me your groundwater is contaminated, what level? I understand that overseas in a lot of areas they use much shallower wells. In Bangladesh, I know, for instance, they were using wells that were sometimes less than 15 feet deep. So of course they're going to be picking up all sorts of contaminants. But I didn't see any of that in any of the rest of the literature. And it certainly, those studies never conform to ours.
Are you saying they're substandard overseas studies?
I'm saying that their experimental design stunk, and if I was on an LSRP review board looking at those, I'd kick the study out.
So your opinion of the World Health Organization study from 1998?
Now, they did let me finish. I read that study too. They had a variety of different evaluations, but they also did conclude that all cemeteries are contaminating groundwater and it's dangerous. They didn't make a blanket statement.
So when they made their recommendation of, well, they had it in meters, but we'll use feet since we're in the United States, of 820 feet away from sources of drinking water, do you think that was unnecessary?
I think it depends on site by site. And I'm not making a comment on it yes and no. I know what our standards are, and I know what our standards work. And I said I don't have confidence in some of these other studies. And I've been overseas and seen a lot of these other sites, and they're not quite like ours.
And so there are, just getting back,
So
there's studies in the United States of cemeteries of this size having no, well, little effect on drinking water.
I haven't seen, well, take a step back. I did not look to see physically the size of the cemetery, so that I can't make a statement on.
But the cemeteries down south that you studied,
Those are different, yeah. Those were like, if you see pictures of the old Louisiana type swamp cemeteries, those types of cemeteries exist along the Mississippi. That's a different story, yeah. You would have had dense numbers of coffins in those, and most of those actually in that time frame that they were born used lead or lead-lined coffins.
Actually, I've spent a lot of time, and most of those are above-ground crypts, aren't they?
Some are. And
Because they are lower than,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mr. Murillo?
Yeah.
1 hectare is equal to 2.471 acres.
1 hectare
It's
is
like almost,
It's a little more than
20 acres.
10 hectares is 25 acres.
yes.
Okay. What about, I didn't hear you mention anything if the bodies were, had metal prosthetics or teeth fillings or implants like pacemakers or defibs or anything like that. How does that factor in?
Really depends on the age of the person. In terms of prosthetics, artificial knees, hips, joints, those, they're designed not to biodegrade. The earlier ones, there were problems with some of the chromium metals and some of the ones they did, and they are actually breaking down in humans that they put the implants in, but the...
And how far back are we talking with those?
I think that first came to light in the late 1990s, early 2000s.
So it is possible that
You
there
could
will
have
be some people buried with those.
Oh, I'm sure you could have some people buried with parts of an artificial joint. Pacemakers, that's, depends on who, what, and when. They come in different sizes. The ancient ones, most of those were removed, I think. The modern ones are much smaller. I'm not sure whether they take them out sometimes in the mortuary or not.
But it would change the biological breakdown of what you said before, where you said the body could be fertilizer. Those parts that are now in the body would not be considered fertilizer. Is that correct?
Right. They would just stay there for eons.
Well, they wouldn't just stay, they could break down into something not healthy, correct?
They're not going to break down that fast.
How fast? Or how slow?
If they didn't break down in the body while you were wearing it, I doubt seriously that you're going to see this thing dissolve overnight or within years.
20 years? 30 years? 40 years? I mean,
I don't know. Nobody has decided as far as I know, nobody has taken prosthetic devices and tried to measure the rate of degradation.
so there is a possibility that the degradation could be problematic.
If you have that many, I can't imagine that one or two people with artificial hips
Well, out of
contaminating
5,400,
arteries.
I don't think it's going to be one or two.
Well, I'm just saying that if you have a cemetery full of nothing but people with artificial hips, I don't know where they got that many.
So there is the potential.
There's always a potential.
Okay. That's
good?
That's all I got.
Mr. Ryan?
I'm good.
Mr. Hughes? Edward, good? Everybody's good? Yep. Charlie?
Yeah, I have two questions. So, I think you made a statement to the effect of shallow wells could be potentially compromised by this type of use. And I know the applicant provided some information regarding some wells and septic systems on the neighboring property. They provided one, I think it was A17, for block 219, lot 13B, which indicated a depth of 212 feet to a well. But did you do any of your own inventory to know what the depth of any of the wells in the vicinity are? Like, if some are historic, they could potentially be shallow wells, but that's not outlandish to say that, correct?
No, there's one or two ways you can search, which hasn't been done. The DEP has a lot of their records online, but when you get into old records, you have to manually search. They do keep records on a lot of these old wells for houses, sometimes going back to the 1950s, 1940s. It's a question of somebody has to manually cull through some of those down there. If you send an OPRA request, they will probably make it available. Or they used to, I'm not sure if they still offer it, they used to have a service that if you call, then they will assign somebody to search for you, but you wouldn't find it electronically.
So, but to your knowledge, has the applicant done that investigation to determine whether there is a presence of any shallow wells in proximity to this site?
No.
Okay. The second question that I have is the applicant is proposing stormwater management infiltration basins that have retaining walls adjacent to some of the plots. And you indicated that the degradation of the bodies generally happens in the first, let's say, 1 to 4 feet below the casket.
Right.
Right. So, and water through this underlying soils can go vertically and then horizontally, right?
More typically, it'll go horizontally than vertically. The only time you'll see the groundwater go vertically is usually if there's actually some type of hydraulic head pushing it down, or if the substrata start curving down.
So
and there's an aquitard in front of it.
So as some of this decaying happens and it gets transported horizontally. If it came to like a retaining wall that had, say, like a drainage system in it to allow for weeping of water table and groundwater and things like that, would that allow for that leachate of, let's say, those components of the body to be transported into the surface water downstream as opposed to into the groundwater table?
It really depends on the rate, and it depends on the matrix that the system is made. I don't know if you're talking about it, because I didn't go into the engineering design, but most stormwater basins right now, the DEP wants permeable rather than impermeable, which means then if anything got in there, you'd more likely to not have grasses and weeds they'd have to maintain.
So what I'll just submit to the board, right? When you're designing like an engineered retaining wall, generally speaking, you don't want to have sources of surface runoff or things that can contribute to the groundwater table because it can impact the wall. You usually have to implement drainage systems behind the wall to allow for the water pressure to alleviate out of that. And this kind of goes to the question that Mr. Ryan had earlier about like proximity of, you know, burial sites to drains and things of that nature. You know, it's possible with a retaining wall, if you have horizontal transport, you could have microbials and other things being transported through the drainage system of the wall into the stormwater basin where it becomes part of, you know, the water course that then gets transported to the downstream areas. So I just wanted to put that on the record for the board.
Thank you, Charlie. Sir?
Yes, thank you. Following up on one of the board members' questions, in addition to, pacemakers and prosthetic devices, would you also have situations in which decomposing bodies would release different types of medicines that the individual had taken, and chemicals like chemotherapy, would they be released into the ground as well, potentially?
Depending on the type of medication, yeah. Antibiotics are designed to kill bacteria or kill microbes. So until they have chemically degraded, that there's a potential. This gets back to, it's still an active question. I was on one of the first FDA panels back in 1992 when we went after the drug industry for the Food and Drug Administration of that very question you're talking about. The question there was more simply down in Florida, where you have a lot of these homes with the elderly and aged, taking cardiac medicines and cardiac glycosides. And at that time, I think most physicians have backed off on it. They were giving them a larger dose, let's say, than necessary, understanding that a certain amount would be absorbed, that's your effective dose, and a large amount would be excreted. And it was being excreted into their local retirement home septic field. And right next to the drinking water well, because Florida doesn't have our regulations. And so, yeah, in that particular scenario, I think it was GlaxoSmithKline, had an issue. And that was one of the first things then that became, if you look at NDA, new drug applications now, they have to, the pharmaceutical companies have to address that issue. The USGS, U.S. Geological Survey, has identified all across the United States the presence of pharmaceuticals in water. So it's an ongoing problem everywhere. But for future use, and basically really since at least 2010, I believe all the pharmaceutical companies, when they're saying we're going to put a new product on the market, as part of the approval by FDA, they have to show that either it's biodegradable or how it will be managed.
In your review of the application and for your testimony, did you consider the impact of the groundwater flow rates on the transport of the body contaminants?
Not the flow rate per se. Flows in a lot of these areas, including Howell and Burlington, are relatively static. They're very slow.
Now, you, in your testimony, talked about generically different types of soil strata in different parts of the state. In your analysis and your testimony tonight, did you base your conclusion on the specific type of soil that is located at the site in question?
I looked at the soil survey of Monmouth County, which has Howell Township soils in it in this area, and they were classified as sandy silt loams.
But did you look at the analysis in the Crest Stormwater Management Report of the specific types of soil at this location?
No, I just,
You indicated that you thought there was a minimal risk to private wells, at least depending on the depth of some of the private wells. Would monitoring wells installed on the property be a way to determine whether, with certainty, whether or not there's any risk to the drinking water of the residents who use well water?
sure.
Nothing further?
Thank you. Jen, you have anything?
No, sir.
Okay. I think they did. Dr. Stankin? Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Bear with me, I do have potentially one follow-up question. Could you give me a quick look at this? Those soils are incompatible with what you said. Just want to have a moment to review the report since it was marked. The stormwater management report that identifies the soils. So just have Dr. Stankin take a quick look at that.
So should we take 5?
You're the chair.
Eileen, we're going to take 5.
The board will now take a 5-minute break and reconvene at 9:42 p.m. Thank you.
Eileen, we're back.
The meeting will now reconvene.
So, Mr. Jackson, you had Dr. Stankin review the stormwater management report for a reason, so
Thank you. Have you had an opportunity to review the stormwater management report?
Yeah.
Were the logs and the soils consistent with the overall view that you had from Howell when you said you looked at the state mapping?
Yeah, it's the same thing.
Same, so it doesn't change your assessment in any way?
No.
Okay, and one final question, if I can have that. The septic fields, how do they have a bigger or less impact than the cemetery is going to have on the properties that have septic fields?
It's kind of a strange question. It's really more proximity. If you have a septic field, you don't want to put your drinking water well too close to it, just for safety's sake. It would be the same thing with the cemetery. I don't know that I'd put a drinking water well. I don't know that I'd put a drinking water well immediately within the cemetery, although I've seen them. It depends on how deep the well is and how well it's screened.
Okay, thank you, that's all I have.
Okay. All right, folks. Mr. Bonanno,
Yes.
you have a witness that you would like to, on the
Yeah.
opposing side. and you say he's from out of state, we're going to grant you an opportunity to have that testimony put on the record so that we then can carry this to another date with an extension of time.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, I guess you'll get sworn in.
He's representing the opposition.
If you'll raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give in this matter is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please state and spell your name for the record.
Frank Getchell, Getchell.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Get,
I didn't get the spelling of the last name.
Frank Getchell,
Thank you.
Getchel,
One more L.
2 L's.
Thank you.
could you run through your educational background for us, please?
Sure. I have a undergraduate degree in mathematics and a master's degree in geology from Syracuse University. And I've been a professional geologist since about 1982. I'm still working.
Do you have any professional licenses? And if so, could you summarize those for us, please?
Excuse me one second. The public, I hear, can you hear him?
Okay, you know what, Frank, well, this is microphone.
Okay.
What university?
Okay, my undergraduate degree is in mathematics from the University of Scranton, and my master's degree is in geology from Syracuse University.
Okay. And you've been practicing?
Since 1982.
And you're
As a
licensed?
consulting hydrogeologist, I'm a licensed geologist in the states of Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware, New Hampshire, Maine, North Carolina,
We'll
South
accept your
Carolina.
credentials then, sir. Go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to run through a couple of background things. This will be very quick. We want to move along, with the chair will allow.
Yes, and you have the microphone right there.
Okay?
Yeah, just share it. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Just very briefly, could you just run through your background as a geologist?
Sure. I'm actually a hydrogeologist, and my area of expertise has been in water supply development, specifically groundwater supply impacts, groundwater supply contamination, groundwater resource evaluations, geoengineering aspects of groundwater and seepage issues. Worked in New Jersey since about 1985 till about 2019. I still do some work down here, but I actually was the office manager of Leggett, Brashears, and Graham in Upper Saddle River, New Jersey for most of that time.
Have you done any work in Monmouth County? And if so, could you tell us about that?
Sure. Like the previous expert, I also worked on the Toms River Chemical Contamination Project. I was an expert hydrogeologist on behalf of the Toms River Water Company, also Suez Water, specifically with respect to the Union Carbide contamination at the Reich Farm site. I've also done work for Old Bridge on modeling related to well field expansion, Monroe Township with respect to expansion and increase of capacity for many of their water supply wells. I've worked elsewhere down the coastal plain also, but those are three probably that are closest.
And can you tell us about work you've been doing up in Saddle River related to groundwater issues and concerns there?
Okay. Actually, it's Upper Saddle River.
Upper Saddle River.
They would beg to differ to make the distinction. But we actually are working on evaluation of potential impact from a large natural burial cemetery that's literally over the border in New York State. It's targeted to have about 20,000 grave sites, 18 acres. And we're in the process of establishing a monitoring network for them to determine background conditions so that if there are impacts, there is a way for them to be able to identify that before too late.
Now, you're aware that you've been sitting through this application before the board to develop a cemetery at Block 2019 in Howell Township. Have you had an opportunity to visit the site?
Yes, I did today.
And have you had a chance to review documents that the applicant has submitted in support of their application for use variance?
Yes, I reviewed the two stormwater reports and the environmental impact statement, and then there was some periphery documentation that was associated with those.
In the materials that you reviewed, did any of those address the proposed cemetery, the effect that the proposed cemetery could have on groundwater and drinking water for the people in the surrounding area?
Not that I recall. They seem to focus primarily on stormwater management and other aspects of the site development. I don't recall seeing anything that was specific to impacts on groundwater quality related to the proposed cemetery.
Now, you heard the testimony earlier today of Mr. Siv, right?
Yes.
And do you recall him testifying about filling in areas above the graves so that they would be, so that there'd be more depth beneath the graves?
Yes, I did.
And can you tell us what your reaction is to that and what your thoughts would be about that?
Well, it was the first I had heard of that, and if it was in any of the documents, I don't recall seeing it. So, as you had questioned, I had focused in and saw the comments regarding the depth to groundwater, even though they were projected. There's no monitor wells, observation wells. There were no physical data besides looking at soil conditions to kind of project what that groundwater surface would be. So that was, kind of one of what I was kind of looking at, 4 to 5 feet. And then I was aware that the graves were going to be 6 feet, which simple algebra tells you that means they're going to be in the groundwater. So that was the first time I had heard that to deal with that the grade is going to be changed, I don't know, throughout the site or just in those areas that they anticipate having that shallow groundwater surface.
But would the type of soil used for, I guess, essentially fill, would that have an impact on the flow of groundwater potentially?
Well, I think in terms of when I look at the site and what I saw, it's heavily vegetated. So when that vegetation gets removed, which I expect given what's being put up there for drawing, that's going to change a lot of the surface drainage. It's going to also change a lot of the uptake of soil moisture and runoff natural occurring. Obviously, that's why there's going to be stormwater retention basins there to deal with some of that flow. So that could potentially change groundwater flow direction, maybe locally.
And in your review of the reports that you described, the stormwater management report, the environmental impact report, do these reports address the impact that the removal of trees for the cemetery would have on groundwater flow?
Again, I don't recall seeing that, no.
And in reviewing the stormwater management plan, can you tell us whether that addresses the potential impact that would have on the groundwater flow?
No, the closest would be the mounding analysis that were completed, but what those are, they're projections of what will happen to the groundwater surface in the immediate vicinity of these proposed basins. They don't continue to project what that would actually look like in terms of the actual groundwater flow beyond those conceptual basins. And those are all, those model runs, they're analytical models. They're based on, they're not site-specific data. They're based on some generic data related to the particular types of aquifer materials or soil materials that are there. So they're not based on somebody actually going to the site and doing some type of testing or sampling and determining an actual permeability or hydraulic conductivity. I believe they're based on actually percolation rates, which then are converted to hydraulic conductivity, which is not the same.
In reviewing the stormwater management plan and the environmental impact plan and visiting the site and doing, I guess, your own research, which you can tell us about, do you believe that there's a potential for the cemetery site to have any impact on the flow of water down toward the area by the marsh bog stream or creek?
Well, first off, we're all assuming that's the groundwater flow direction. There is no hard data besides looking at topographic maps, which is something I, as a practicing hydrogeologist, would do at first blush also, before actually going and then to kind of refine what it would be with using observation wells, some sort of a device that I could duplicate measurements, I could look at variations over time, seasonally with respect to climate change and impacts and so forth. But with that said, regarding the flow towards the marsh bog brook, I think pretty much that would be what you would expect. It would primarily be from the northwest towards the southeast.
Would there be the potential with 100-year storms, 50-year storms for this to cause flooding to the area beyond the marsh? There are apartments over there. Would they be at risk?
The intent of those stormwater management basins is to put the water back into the ground. You know, once it goes into the ground, as you'd heard previous testimony, yes, it's going to eventually discharge back up into that wetland area, into the marsh brook. It's not necessarily that we're going to be going down a slope. There's a three-dimensional aspect to how the flow goes. It's not two-dimensional. So the question is, how readily can that water go down vertically before it starts to move and then discharge back up into the wetland area? And then, of course, the question just comes out as to whether or not the stream can handle what that excess flow would be.
And in your work in Monmouth County, you're familiar with the types of soil that are typically found in Monmouth County?
I look at them in respect to aquifers.
Okay.
So, in terms of the makeup, is it mostly sand? Is it mostly clay? How does that affect the amount of, in terms of once, keep in mind when we talk about soil, we're talking usually about the material that's above the aquifer. It's the stuff that's not usually under a saturated condition, unless, say, it's a hydric soil like in a wetland complex. And those soils develop from a native geologic material, okay? So in this case, the Cohansey, which is the Cohansey Kirkwood, so basically it's the upper part is primarily a sand with units of fine gravel, units of clay and silt in it. When that material is exposed to the atmosphere under natural conditions, over time with vegetation and so forth, organic material mixing, it develops into a soil. Okay, so I just want to make that distinction. I look at it primarily with respect to its groundwater transmitting capability, its groundwater storage capability. But yes, I am familiar with the Kirkwood Cohansey.
So that with the surface water getting into the ground, would it just flow straight through the soil, or would there be areas, fissures, and different types of strata in the ground that would affect the way in which it flows, horizontally, vertically?
This is unconsolidated material, so it's, when you go to the beach, it's probably the best way I can describe it. You see loose sand. If it gets saturated, sometimes if it has a lot of silt, it can get kind of dense in that, but it's not going to usually have fractures or fissures in it. That's not the nature of this particular aquifer, unless there's some really different type scenarios. But what will normally happen is that water will go down vertically. It will spread because it isn't just a straight pore space conduit that continues down. So as it goes down, it's going to kind of trickle out and it's going to kind of spread. If it gets to the situation where it winds up with some kind of a low permeability layer, you heard the reference to a perch zone. that water may get onto that perch zone, say a silt or a clay. Some people, see these large like iron bands that maybe form in the soil and so forth. It may spread horizontally, but at some point it'll find a case where either enough water goes through, it can continue to move it through, or it'll find some kind of a break or a change in the makeup, and then it will continue down. Once it's in that saturated aquifer situation, then it's going to be dominated primarily by what's called the gradient or the hydraulic gradient, and it's going to be more of a spread, we'll just say laterally.
But then there is the potential for it to also migrate downward.
Yeah, these aquifers get their recharge, between what's called the outcrop areas, which are further to the west, okay, where they occur under water table conditions. But there's also a vertical component. So under certain conditions, you have what are called flow regimes. So shallow groundwater can actually discharge to local wetlands and streams, but some of it, depending on where it is topographically, can continue down vertically and then mix with deeper groundwater and move further, in this case, further to the east.
And the east would be toward the front of the property.
Yes, I'm sorry, yeah. I mean, so theoretically, looking at that stream there, Marsh Bog, that's probably a major discharge area for most of the aquifer, but there could be some that could conceivably have more of a component towards the south, towards the Manasquan.
Now, have you reviewed literature, articles regarding the impact or potential impact of decomposing bodies on groundwater and drinking water?
Yes.
Can you tell us about some of the studies that you've reviewed?
Well, there's the Baltimore study, which was put together by the sanitary, I believe, engineer for the city of Baltimore, because they were starting to put together a land use ordinance that was going to start to regulate these types of natural burial cemeteries. And so in there's a lot of information regarding other studies. As Dr. Stenkin had mentioned earlier, a lot of it is from Europe, but there is some from the United States also. There are studies being done actually up in New Hampshire. There are studies being done in New York State. There are studies being done in Virginia, all focusing on this because it is becoming such a larger part now of dealing with.
And none of the studies are complete?
Excuse me?
Any of the studies complete?
They tend to currently be ongoing. Sorry. There's a USGS study actually that focused on Michigan. That is a complete study, but it looks at a bunch of different types of cemeteries. And again, the impact on groundwater.
Can you tell us about the Baltimore study and whether the Baltimore study makes any recommendations for the type of hydrogeological study that would be useful in determining whether or not there's an impact to groundwater, drinking water?
Well, I think there's
an
a,
objection to a Baltimore study
Yeah.
that's based on studies that aren't complete, simply to make recommendations for zoning regulations? I don't know what the relevancy of that is here. I mean, what the recommendations are, whether they were adopted, whether they were approved, it's two different things.
This is the Baltimore County white paper we're talking about?
yes, but that county was the basis for the actual regulations that were put into place for Baltimore County regarding cemeteries.
But those regulations are not in play here, so I don't know what they base politically, et cetera, their regulations. We don't have those regulations.
Got it.
I think it's instructive for the board to hear what other entities are doing, what other parts of the country are doing.
Well, we've heard it. Is there anything pertinent to the study that we need to know about?
Well, I think what is pertinent is that what you see as a common theme is the concept of separation distances, specifying minimum separations between these types of cemeteries and water resources, whether they be streams, whether they be stormwater basins, whether they be supply wells. So there is recognition of the fact that that is something that looks at. And certain researchers give certain distances, but they all tend to be the same. There's also identification of certain types of parameters that should be monitored for water quality as being indicative or for tracing or setting up benchmarks for future reference as to whether or not there are impacts from such cemeteries.
Mr. Bonanno?
Yes. In reviewing the CREST, the applicant's stormwater management plan, strike that. Let's see. In addition to the removal of trees, you said possibly having an impact on surface water flow and groundwater, would the construction of the actual graves potentially have an impact on groundwater flow?
Well, when you're, obviously the soil currently is in its own state. It's been like that way for about 10,000, 12,000 years. So when you go to excavate the grave, obviously you're disturbing that soil. And you can be changing the properties, the permeability of the soil, the porosity of the soil, and so forth. So just by de facto that you're doing that, it's going to happen. You're going to change the properties of those soil. Now the soil below that, that's not disturbed, obviously will still continue to be in whatever state it is.
Would that have an impact potentially on the seasonal high water table?
Well, you got to keep in mind the groundwater that you see at this site originates not just from the site, but it originates from other areas, okay? And so that seasonal high water table is typically reflecting recharge to the aquifer that commonly occurs during, like, we get most of our recharge normally between starting in late fall all the way through to early spring. Because in late fall what happens, all the plants stop evapotranspirating, and so they stop pulling the water out of the soil. And so now what happens is the groundwater levels can start to come up. Then you get snow melt, you get rain, and you don't have plants taking that up. So a lot of that water now can get past the root zones, and that's what contributes to the seasonally high groundwater table. That's why they call it a seasonally high. You don't typically see it during the summer months. So if now you change the vegetation and the land coverage of an area like this, you're going to see some localized influences. When that precipitation occurs and those recharge events occur, you may get localized, unintentional, I'll call it mounding, just like with respect to the stormwater systems.
Now, have you factored into your assessment of the site, the presence of the Evergreen Cemetery that's just, I guess, sort of the northwest of this? And if so, can you tell us how?
I just, to be honest with you, use it as a point of reference, and I went up there and just recognized it as my understanding is it's a conventional cemetery.
Conventional cemetery meaning vaulted or natural?
That's my understanding. It's, at least more recently, they would be vaulted graves. And it is up gradient, as had been previously pointed.
So you're talking about your work in Upper Saddle River, so that then as you were describing it, they're installing monitoring wells to determine whether or not there would be an impact potentially on?
The cemetery isn't, the town is. So the town's putting it around the periphery, so basically for early warning, because all of those residents are all on private wells. There's no public water system there.
So, in your opinion, would the installation of monitoring wells prior to any construction be able to address whether or not potentially there could be contamination of private wells?
Well, it would establish a background. And if there's contamination there now, well, it's not from the cemetery. And that would be useful if sometime down the road, somebody were to start saying that they were getting contamination, they would have a way to have a benchmark to compare to. But also what it would allow is to have an actual determination of groundwater level and groundwater flow direction. The other thing is we keep talking about the groundwater flow and so forth, and we are really only looking at it from the perspective of the natural flow. If a well is in the aquifer and a well pumps, it reverses groundwater flow direction. How far out it goes is contingent upon many different factors. But, you know, it could be on the order of tens of feet, it could be on the order of hundreds of feet. So if you had a network of monitor wells that were out there, they could also be used to take water level measurements, and you could establish very quickly whether or not there is any influence between the wells in those homes and the groundwater surface at the cemetery. And if there isn't, I think that would, you know, that would allay a lot of fears.
Charlie,
Yes, Mr. Chair.
you heard what was just said about these monitoring wells?
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you can install them in advance of any project, you'd be able to set a baseline, at least for the existing condition with any potential impacts that may have occurred with the Evergreen Cemetery upstream. Just a question, so you said it's your understanding that's a traditional, so they're in vaults. Do you know, have you spoken to like the owners or the operators of that?
I just, looking at the cemetery, there's some newer graves and so forth there.
Make sure
And
you
I'm
talk
sorry,
towards the mic.
there are some newer graves there, so the best of my, you know, I'm just, you can call it an assumption, but I'm willing to bet on it.
Okay. So with the monitoring wells, right, there have been other applications in the town. You know, I think it's long before my time with the Wawa up on, I think, Howell Road and Route 33. There was residents up there that had wells and were concerned about underground tanks with, you know, the fueling station, stuff like that. You know, the board stipulated conditions requiring that the developer put in monitoring wells. I'm pretty sure they're still in there to this date, and that gives the municipality some sort of safeguard to set a baseline and be able to monitor to see whether there's an impact. I guess the question is, over time, it sounds like there is no set protocol of like what allowable levels or thresholds of bacteria and microorganisms are, so I think that's the challenging aspect of it. You could set a baseline of here it is prior to construction, but what's a safe level?
Well,
I
let
don't
me ask this, Charlie. All of a sudden you find out something's down there, isn't it kind of like too little, too late at that point?
Yeah, I mean, I would think any kind of approval, potential approval from the board would have to be very uniquely worded to have safeguards on what can and can occur after something triggers some kind of benchmark for what's a safe and not safe level. And like I said, I'm not an expert in cemeteries and how bodies decompose or anything like that, so I can't tell you what those levels would be.
Thank you, Charlie.
Could I just offer something to that? I think in terms of those wells, what you would be looking at is you wouldn't be looking at bacteria. You'd be looking at some of those soluble compounds that the previous expert had discussed: nitrate, phosphorus, chloride, sodium. So you could establish those right away, okay? They all have drinking water standards associated with them. And the point would be just to establish that background. And along with it, though, which is very important, it's not just the chemistry, it's also the physical aspect, which is the water levels. Which way is the groundwater flowing? So if it's showing that that groundwater flow direction is pretty consistent going away, you know, that allows you to relax that concern. But right now, you don't know that.
Got it. Thank you.
I have no further questions at this
Mr.
point.
Jackson?
Excuse me, 1 minute.
Yeah. Okay. So, board members, you have some questions? Go ahead. Ms. Compton?
So there was mention earlier in the testimony about fill, adding fill to raise the levels of the cemetery so that the bodies wouldn't be hitting any sort of water planes or anything like that. So how will that impact whether it being just laid or ultimately dug? How does that impact the flow, the water flow, or any sort of settlement with the grounds?
So not knowing where specifically that's going to take place, so again, this is all just conceptual. If you're going to start altering the topography, that could alter also what goes on with that surface water runoff that isn't necessarily targeted for those recharge basins, but is just going to be allowed to infiltrate in. Again, I don't have that information. All I can say is conceptually, it could alter it on a very localized level.
I'm kind of asking as a general, like.
Yeah. I think the one thing about it too is when we talked about that earlier question about, some of the commonalities to a lot of the research, there's also the issue about that separation distance. And the previous expert talked about, how the body decomposes and, vertically how it, migrates down. It's kind of the same as, and he used the term, I hate to say this, but kind of like a septic system. You need to maintain a minimum separation distance. State of New Jersey requires 4 feet. It's a good number to go with. Some researchers go to 6 feet. But my point just being is if the whole point of raising the elevation is to get the 6 foot of burial and still maintain the 4 feet of separation, then that sounds like a good practice. And it seems kind of consistent with other things that the state of New Jersey does and how it regulates. And by the way, the use of monitor wells, if you put in large subsurface disposal systems, I'm not talking about individual, but if you're doing it the large type systems, monitor wells are typically required as a mechanism by which you monitor the effectiveness of those beds. So I hate drawing those parallels to the cemetery, but there are a lot of parallels.
Go ahead, Charlie.
You'd mentioned the effect of the trees on the ability of the soil to, the groundwater to drain into the soil, and the fact that when there's trees there, it slows down the absorption of the rainwater. I guess what I'm getting at is they're looking at to basically clear cut the property and then put a few trees in there. Would it be effective to leave islands of existing trees in the property?
It couldn't hurt. But again, a statement like that is, I would feel much more comfortable if I knew how that groundwater flow moved across the site, because it might identify the areas that would be more conducive than others, as opposed to just willy-nilly, affecting. I mean, somebody put a lot of thought into how they're laying this out, so rather than just affecting it, you'd want to have some sort of a basis for that.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Mr. Chair, if I could just make a point of clarity, because there's talk about the stormwater report prepared by Crest and that there was not any soil information or testing that was done. So any application that comes before this board has to comply with the town stormwater control ordinance and also the state stormwater management rules. The rules that were amended and even prior before that, but the most current rules require intensive infiltration testing and soil test pits that need to be done. So the applicant did do 6 soil test pits. So that's not a case boring or anything like that. They actually did profile pits, within the footprint of each one of these basins. Then they did do hydraulic conductivity testing in accordance with the BMP. We had some comments in our report about them needing to demonstrate whether they were disturbed or undisturbed samples, because that can lead to misleading results on the infiltration rates that are used in the analysis. That it would need to be rectified as a condition of any board approval should this be, approved and go to resolution compliance. I do want to point out for the board's, just general understanding, right, with the grading plan for the site, where the plots are, they're generally grassed area, right? When you do stormwater modeling, there's a certain, they call it a curve number, which is basically a measure of how permeable or impermeable a surface is. Good soils, good grass could be on the lower range in the 30s or 40s. Impervious asphalt, something like that's 98. So all your runoff is basically falls from the sky, and it basically gets conveyed to downstream once it's collected, ultimately to stormwater or water course. So their parking areas on the site, they have curbing along the southern and eastern portion of the parking area. So any impervious surface that's generated with the site development is captured by a conveyance system and directly routed to a stormwater management basin. So that's going to be a big source of surface runoff that supplements the groundwater table. That is captured and is directed to infiltration basins, but you do still have a significant portion of the site that does get rainfall into the grass. It does supplement the groundwater table. I just wanted to make that point of clarity for the board's understanding.
Thank you, Charlie. Pleasure of the board. Do we want to open this to public to see if they're with Mr. Stankin? Dr. Stankin? Is Dr. Stankin available for questioning from the public?
Yes, he's here.
You have no other witnesses, Mr. Jackson?
I was going to have my client testify, but if you want to cross-examine Dr. Stankin, or this witness.
Can Dr. Stankin be here next meeting?
I don't know what the date is.
Eileen, what are we looking at for dates?
October 7th, I have 2 applications. October 28th, I have 2 applications. November 4th, I have 1. And November 25th, I have 3 scheduled. And December 9th and 16th, I have nothing.
I might not be here myself. Well, I don't know, what does that mean? Are all those dates available, or even the ones?
Well, yeah, I'm not going to be here on November 4th, I'll just tell you.
End of October, I take
So,
federal jury duty.
end of October? So December
Last week
6th?
of October to November 1st, I can pick for federal jury duty.
Yeah, we're going to do it for both then. Eileen, you said December 6th or 9th?
December 9th and 16th, I have nothing scheduled yet.
Okay. God bless you.
Thank you. December 9th and 16th, I'm clear. Are you clear December 9th and 16th? Yeah, 9th and 16th works for us. And I don't know if Mr. Ketchel was done being cross-examined by the public, or, I don't know if yes, I don't know what it is.
He's the public's witness, right?
No.
Go ahead.
Some of the public's.
Some of the public's. Is there anyone else from the public that would like to question Mr. Gretchel?
Getchell.
Getchel.
Mr.
All right, so let's open it up.
Make a motion to open.
Wait,
Second.
all in favor?
Yes.
Eileen, we're opening to public for question.
The board will now be open to the public for questioning. If you have a question, please come up, state your name and address.
They're going to have questions from a couple people.
Hi. My name is Ann Joy Becker. I live at 1 Marion Avenue in Howell, New Jersey. And you can swear me in. I have one question only.
If you're going to ask questions, you don't need to be sworn in unless you're giving testimony.
Oh, okay.
Question
No,
you can
no,
ask.
No testimony, I'm sorry. Okay, question. If a cemetery is situated on a porous soil, and if I heard correctly, it's sand or gravel, the seepage, which contains bacteria, viruses, organic, inorganic, chemical decomposition products from decomposing bodies, can't it rapidly move through the soil and potentially contaminate the underlying groundwater, posing a risk to water sources if not properly managed?
Well, I think, the answer.
Okay. Go ahead, maybe both of you.
Either one. Because I was told it was sand, so now I just need to understand.
Is this like a dual question for either witness? I don't know
She
how you're
could-
doing this.
Either witness.
Either one can answer.
Or is he coming back for cross-examination, or I'm sorry, I just,
Why do we keep on talking about cross-examination? I just have a
No,
question.
he keeps,
Yeah.
that's the term.
That's what the question is, yeah.
the question is, Mr. Getchell, go ahead,
Yes.
please.
Okay, so from my perspective, in terms of, you need to have enough fluid flow, and I believe this is consistent with what Dr. Stankin has said earlier. You need to have enough fluid flow, so you're talking about a body. It's not as if you're dumping out 55-gallon drums of water onto the ground, they're going to seep. So it's a very slow process. And that separation distance from the water table is what works to your benefit, because the longer that fluid, to use a
It's okay.
generic
The
type.
grayish fluid.
Yes, stays within the sand. Obviously, gravel it goes through quicker, sand it goes through not quite as quick, fine sand it goes through slower, silt and clay and so forth. That's called the permeability. The coarser the material, the quicker it will go through. But as it's going through, you're in a zone where it's not saturated, okay? So you have microbes that already live there, and they're going to be looking at what's going by, and there's going to be a certain degree of fixation. It's what they call the vadose zone. So there's gases, normal pore gases that are in there that liquid's got to get through. So it's a slow process. The closer you are to the water table and the more permeable the material, that's the bad situation. So it really depends, case by case. All I can tell you is what it's going to range from. But I think, to be consistent with the other testimony, it's not a lot of material going through very quickly. I think what you have to worry about is precipitation driving through and the precipitation coming in contact and then helping to move it through the pore spaces. Sand and gravel doesn't work as good as silt and clay.
And this is allegedly sand.
Your
that
sand.
I heard. Okay.
Yes.
So 5,500 plots in a 10-acre radius and not being embalmed or whatever, it's a decomposed body. How does it not get into the drinking water of Farmingdale?
Well, let's make a distinction between drinking water and aquifer.
Okay,
All
I got
right?
you.
So the aquifer is the resource. It becomes drinking water if there's a well that pulls it out.
Okay.
So to the best of my knowledge, from what I've seen here, the only wells that currently exist are to the north, and those are to the northwest, I'm sorry.
Northwest.
And those are the ones that are in the up gradient section. So to simplify it, they're up here, the
And the water's
cemetery
down
is here,
here.
and water's going. Now, but as my previous comment was that if a well pumps, depending on how much it pumps, okay, you can hinge it. And so then you can move the water back in the opposite direction. I don't have any indications to say that that's the case. They're domestic wells. If it was, say, a municipal well that was over there, pretty good chance you would be reversing. You wouldn't have a problem because you'd be pumping hundreds of gallons per minute, which is a significant amount. Typical residential wells only pump a couple gallons a minute, unless maybe it's an irrigation well or something like that.
Okay.
So the chances under the natural conditions, it's when you start moving things with the recharge and so forth. And this was my point about if you actually had observation/monitor wells, you'd know what that groundwater flow direction actually is. You could monitor over the course of a year. You could put a logger in one of them which measures the water level. You could see what happens if it's, during the course of a day, if somebody puts one of their wells on, if that doesn't change, you're not influencing the water level. So the chance of that hinge occurring isn't going to happen.
Okay.
But you don't know any of that, and you can only, right now, it's conjecture just based on distances and so forth.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Meyer, question.
Stephen Meyer, 56 Adelphia Road. I don't know which of you I want to ask this of. Well, first, Marsh Bog Brook is called that because it's two cranberry bogs.
If you're going to make comment and statement, we need to get you sworn in.
Are you going to ask a question, or are you going to make a
I was
statement?
sworn the last meeting.
Okay, then you continue to be under oath. We're good.
Okay.
That's why I went ahead. I didn't realize you wanted to
No
re-swear me. You've spoken about the water moving through. The problem is not just the wells of mine and my neighbors. The problem is also those wetlands that are just below your property and really attached to it. Anything that comes through the ground. Now your water source, your recharge area starts up in Turkey Swamp and becomes continuous coming down through the east. And by the time it gets to there, you've got water moving through the soil, but not necessarily part of your water table. That's where we're more concerned with, is that water moving laterally through the soil, picking up whatever is in it, which is going to include all the drugs that you're taking. How do we deal with this if we find we have a problem afterwards? Now, I'm hearing the discussion about test wells. What do you do when you find something? The bodies are already in the ground. You're not ever going to be able to exhume a cemetery. How do you deal with this?
Mr. Jackson?
That question had a lot of factual premises in it that I don't know if that's what the witness agrees with. I mean, there was a whole testimony about where the water comes from.
Yeah, it's trying to get some background to it.
I don't know if any of that's accurate or not. That certainly wasn't in the testimony so far about where it originates. I think with both.
Well, the water that's moving through there, let's assume it comes from 2 lots up and from Evergreen Cemetery it soaks in. Now, this question still is, what do you do? How do you prevent that water coming through the graves from getting into the wetlands? And once into the wetlands, into Marsh Bog Brook.
So not just rainfall, but anything that's coming from upstream.
Upstream. Well, you have 2 different things. You have sheet flow, and then you have what moves through the soil, the ground flow.
Dr. Stankin?
Sheet flow is what your pond takes care of.
I wouldn't expect there to be sheet flow.
Well, of course there's going to be sheet flow.
No, I
When
mean,
it rains, it runs across the surface.
Yeah, but I mean, I would not expect that to be picking up any kind of pharmaceuticals from bodies.
We're not worried about the sheet flow. It's
The
just
lateral
moving through
flow,
the soil.
right, the lateral flow goes back to the rate of flow and what microbes are in between the point of discharge. In other words, if one were to take a line of bodies and suddenly put them in a row 10 feet from the target area, as opposed to 150 feet and 100 feet. So you're going to have a different rate of input of the material, because you're talking about, when you're talking about residual pharmaceuticals in a human, it's going to be in the micro to parts per billion.
So, Mr. Meyer, if I could just interject and maybe rephrase the question that we've lost in this. If monitoring wells get put in place after the cemetery is approved and bodies are buried, and there are contaminants that come up in the monitoring wells, what happens then? That's the question.
That was Mr. Hughes' question. I thought that was answered.
I don't think it was answered.
Also, what wasn't answered is, what is the type of test schedule? Who's going to be testing it, who's going to be keeping the records? I mean, you can throw test wells in. I mean, I can go out and, I can have somebody come in and do a boring on my property for a test well. If there's nobody testing it, it doesn't accomplish anything.
That becomes part of the operational.
But I still think that the question of, if you find something in a monitoring well after the fact, what happens?
That's the question.
Right, so I don't, and I think Mr. Myers had said, he assumes that there's not gonna be this mass exhumation, so what happens then? I think that's a legitimate question, and I'm not sure that you're prepared to answer it tonight. We can, obviously, we're not gonna finish tonight, so.
Yes.
That is a question that has been asked multiple times and has not been answered.
So are we recommending that we carry this and have that question answered
I think
at the next meeting?
I think it's an important
Very important question. To me.
Yeah, I'm up past my bedtime at this point, so.
It's okay.
Us too.
All right, thank you.
So are we saying that that's an operations question versus a question that he can answer?
I don't know that that's operational, to be honest.
I agree with you.
I think that's more regulatory, and so we've already established, just to be clear, that the DEP does not regulate this kind of issue, and LSRP would not be involved in this kind of issue, so I think that the offering up of monitoring this is great, but and I think Mr. Myers asks another good question, who's actually doing the monitoring, and when something comes up in that monitoring, what happens?
Okay.
But you do use that as a reference.
So,
You do have to say.
so, Mr. Meyer, we're not going to get that answer until December 9th.
I just wanted to make sure before I went and sat down.
Okay, you got it. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I think Mr. Ketchel has a clarification on that, that might answer that question. Because we hope we don't have to bring him back, so
I don't think the balance of the public has had a chance to question him, so I don't necessarily think it's 20 to 11, this is way past the time.
Yes.
So we're going to need to bring Mr.
He's gonna
Ketchel
have to
back?
come back, I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Okay.
Okay, so, case number BA 24-03, Third Avenue Associates. All right, let's close, let's,
No, I don't think we should close the public, because I don't think all of them got a chance to speak.
we're gonna leave it open.
Carry the public.
We're gonna carry the public. Case number BA 24-03, Third Avenue Associates. We're carrying this to December 9th.
Correct.
First application on, maybe the only application on the agenda. All right, with an expiration date, end of December?
We'll consent to that, yes, we agree, stipulate, extend the time period to the end of December.
31 December.
Okay.
Okay, expiration, 2024. And we will continue public comments at that point in time. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Can I have a motion?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Eileen, we're closed.